Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. My name is Lindsay, and I'm a 19-year-old female living in rural Pennsylvania with my parents and two of my sisters. There's not much going on where we live, so I listen to your stories every morning at work, always wishing I had one of my own to share. Well, tonight I finally got one. To set the stage a bit, my older sister and I had only been hiking once before this experience, so we aren't exactly experts. We do, however, always bring safety items, like pocket knives, flashlights, and a medical kit. For the sake of anonymity, I'll refer to my sisters as M, my older sister, and F, my younger sister. Today is F's birthday, and she's never been hiking before, so we figured we'd take her on a small trip to enjoy the beautiful weather. The area we hiked in is actually part of the state game lands, where hikers are allowed on the mountain trails during the off-season for hunting. Not many people know about this spot because there are no signs or markers until you walk a mile or so into the woods. By then, you reach a small parking lot that is almost always empty. There are two main trails marked by occasional blue dots on trees. Without those spray-painted dots, you might not even know it's a trail because these paths see so little use. Probably not the best first hike for a couple of newbies like us, but it's really close and offers a quiet hike with plenty of scenery. So we decided to hike that trail again since we were somewhat familiar with it. We were excited and ready for a relaxing walk through the mountains and hopefully some cool photos along the way. We walked from our house to the bottom of the mountain where the hike would start. On the way there, we told F about the trail and how beautiful it was. M expressed some concern that there could be animals nearby since the area isn't often visited by people. I figured there would be animals, of course, it's the woods, but I never imagined what I was about to experience. After about 15 minutes of walking, we reached the parking lot. M led the way, I was in the middle, and F was behind us. The first part of the trail takes you up a small but steep hill. M made it to the top before F and me, and as she did, we heard a loud rustling sound to our left. I figured it was just some birds or maybe a squirrel messing around in the trees, but then M suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, causing F and me to stop too. Just as I was about to ask what was going on, M calmly said, "Turn around, guys." F and I exchanged confused looks, not understanding what she meant. I asked why, and she said something that I'll never forget. "There's someone over there. Run." Now, that sentence was a lot more scary to me and F because we know M very well and she doesn't scare easily. So to hear the clear panic in her voice as she ordered us to run away from something that neither F or I saw was terrifying. M and F immediately started sprinting back down the small hill as I was still standing in my place. I quickly looked behind me, but I saw nothing. I did hear something though. I was still very confused because I hadn't actually seen anything and M never saw what she saw. I ran over to M and F who were waiting for me just before the entrance to the parking lot. I think part of the reason I hesitated running right away was because I thought M might be exaggerating a little. I should have known by the look on her face that she was not messing around. I had a miniature hatchet multi-tool and a pocket knife on my belt, and you better believe I had them at the ready. I had no idea what I was expecting, but I knew that whatever might run out of those woods behind us was going to get a full face of stainless steel. When I reached my sisters, I asked them what exactly we were running from. She just told us to keep moving as she constantly looked back at the trail we had just come from. She even told us to jog just in case it was following us. We did. After maybe jogging a quarter mile or so, M finally told us what we were running from. She said she looked in the direction of the noise we had all heard, and what she saw was a gray figure hunched over about 10 feet off the trail. She described it as being at least the height of F, who is around 56. She said it looked to be bipedal, but she didn't stick around long enough to take in every detail about the figure. However, she did note that it looked as if it was shuffling towards us. I believe that's what made her get us out of there so fast. She must have feared that we were being chased. Now, I never have believed in monsters of cryptids or anything, but M said she honestly has no idea what the thing was. We don't have any type of animal in Pennsylvania that matches that description, at least as far as I know. I know that black bears stand on their hind legs sometimes, but they are not gray, and it didn't sound big enough to be a bear. The only other thing it might have been is a human. But why would someone hear us obviously distressed and not call out to let us know they were there and were not a threat? Unless the person was not there as a friendly hiker, possibly a person living on the mountain, maybe someone doing drugs and were afraid they would get busted. I don't know. That seems to be the only logical explanation. But I am not fully convinced it was a person. I don't believe in Bigfoot or anything else like that. But who knows? By the time we were almost home, Em told us that she used to go to the bus stop with two of the neighbor kids years ago. She said they would always talk about a mystery animal that they would see walking around in the woods near their house, which is very close to the state game lands. At first, she didn't believe them because she had never seen such a thing. But one time when the neighbor kid's grandmother was with them at the bus stop, Em asked about this mystery animal. The grandmother is and has always been a religious person and didn't seem to be the type of person to believe in something like her grandkids had explained. But to Em's surprise, the grandmother said she also witnessed the mystery animal lurking around. What's more is our house is just across the lawn from where our neighbors claimed to spot this unknown creature. I am not sure if these two experiences are related. Besides, that was years ago. But could the figure Em encountered in the woods tonight be the mystery animal? Maybe it was a human. Maybe it was an animal. Who knows for sure? But what I do know is, I don't think we'll be hiking on that state game lens again anytime soon. My wife and I went back to her hometown in Brisbane, Australia for the New Year's holidays to spend some time relaxing in the sun with her extended family and friends. Unfortunately, our time there was tainted by a strange encounter with a man who insisted, with increasingly aggressive persistence, that I wear the party hat that came out of the bonbon I shared with him. For those who may not know, a bonbon is a type of party cracker that two people pull apart to open, revealing a small trinket like a whistle, balloon, or party hat. At the party, I knew almost no one except for my wife's immediate family, which consisted of just 4 people. There were about 20 people at the gathering. After dessert, the bonbons were handed out. I was sitting next to a man who appeared to be in his 30s. He looked fairly normal at first, but I noticed that he hadn't had any alcohol the whole evening. He was only sipping on the same ginger beer that he had been holding since I first walked in. We exchanged a brief nod when I sat next to him, but other than that, we didn't speak. Then the bonbons were presented, and suddenly, I found myself pulling one end of a cracker with him. Other guests had already started pulling theirs apart, so I joined in. A small folded square of paper fell into my lap. It was a party hat, purple and crown-shaped, made from what looked like tissue paper. I chuckled and offered it to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stared at me with cold, hard eyes. "Put it on, mate," he said, sounding more like an order than a suggestion. I immediately felt uncomfortable and didn't know whether to laugh at his strange reaction or not. I excused myself, saying I'd give it to one of the kids since it was obviously too small for my head. He didn't seem to like that answer. "Hey, come on. It's a party. Just have some fun and put the hat on," he insisted, his voice visibly angry now. The awkwardness was unbearable, so I told him I'd go find one of the kids to give it to. I walked over to my wife and asked her who the man was. She said she didn't know him, but that his name was Jono. She then took the hat from me. I noticed Jono wasn't sitting at the table anymore and was instead mingling with the other guests. But even as he talked to them, he would glance over at me, pointing me out and making some remark to them. They looked confused and somewhat uncomfortable, probably because he was gesturing as if putting a hat on, then making a face when he looked at me. Later, I was having a conversation with my wife's brother-in-law when Jono suddenly appeared out of nowhere and said to him, "You see this guy here?" He looked at me with disgust. He wouldn't even put the hat on. It's New Year's Eve and he wouldn't even have any fun. Her brother-in-law looked really confused and quickly steered the conversation back to something else, clearly trying to ignore Jono. As Jono left our chat, he said to me, coming in close to my ear, "You'll wear that hat, even if I have to put it on you deadhead myself." Well, when someone says something like that, what do? The whole rest of the evening was spent in nervous anticipation of another run-in with John O. He was still there, of course, watching me from one side of the room or the other. Sometimes he would grin and make a weapon with his finger and go bang, bang, bang silently from across the room. I did, however, come face to face with him again that night as I went to the toilet. It was occupied and I stood waiting by the door. I heard the toilet flush and then the door opened. It was Jono. He looked me up and down, then put his arm across the door frame. Sorry, only for people who wear party hats. He looked defiant, psychotic, and very dangerous. Then he laughed and removed his arm. A few moments after I had entered the toilet, there was a massive bashing sound on the door. The door shook on its hinges. Once, twice, then one final time, which knocked the door handle off completely. Then Jono screaming at me from outside in the hall. Wear the hat. It's a party. Wear it. Then there was a weird silence. The only sound was the muffled music coming from the living room. Everyone was silent. It stayed like that for a few minutes, maybe more. Then I exited. Everyone seemed to be acting normally, and what's more, there was no Jono to be found. One guest, I didn't know their name, asked me if I had heard the guy banging his head against the toilet door, and I wasn't going to stick around to see if he was still there. I grabbed my wife and made an excuse to leave, and we got out of there. But it didn't end there. The next day, around 3 a.m., there were 3 or 4 sharp knocks on my front door. They definitely weren't from somebody's hand. Sounded more like a hammer or something heavy. I opened the door very slowly and found no one there. Then I noticed it. Nailed to my front door with a 10-penny nail through it was the purple party hat that I had pulled from the bonbon. We cut our holiday short and flew home the next day. Prabdeep Prabshan, known as Prab, was a Canadian student and Army reservist from Toronto who moved to Australia in 2011 to pursue a law degree at the prestigious Bond University on the Gold Coast, Queensland. At 25, Prab returned to Canada in April 2013 during Australia's Easter study break to visit family and friends. Afterward, he returned to Australia in early May to resume his studies, but first planned a hiking trip to Mount Kosciuszko in the Australian Blue Mountains. Before heading out, he stayed with some friends in Sydney for a few nights. On May 13th, these friends drove him to Padstow train station, believing he was about to board a train to the Blue Mountains. However, despite the fact that he wasn't expected back for nearly a week, Prab returned to Sydney the very next day, where he began exhibiting strange behavior. First, he visited the Sydney branch of the Juicy Rent-A-Car company and rented a van, which he was supposed to return in Melbourne 2 days later, on May 15th. This wouldn't have seemed strange in itself, as Mount Kosciuszko is located roughly halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, but given that Prab had already been on his way to the Blue Mountains, it raised questions. Why would he turn back to rent a vehicle? Later that same day, he was spotted on security footage at a convenience store near Jindabyne, likely picking up supplies for his journey. Instead of reconnecting with his friends or checking into a hotel for the night, it's believed Prab slept in the van. On the morning of Tuesday, May 14th, Prab drove the rented van to the Charlotte Pass ski resort. However, rather than parking in the guest lot, he chose the staff parking area. He then set off to hike the main range trail. The choice of staff parking stands out because it suggests that Prab was experiencing an unusual amount of stress. Normally, someone as organized and careful as him would have been concerned about the van being towed for being in a restricted area. But no, on that occasion, it doesn't seem to have bothered him in the slightest, almost like he had more pressing opportunities. What's also extremely curious about this return to the mountain is that Prab didn't seem to be carrying any of the necessary survival items, as his map, compass, GPS system, tent, and cold weather clothing were left behind in the van. However, the lack of cell phone in the van and the fact that one of his food packages had been opened leads us to believe that he carried those with him onto the trailhead. But it seems the gear he had on him is of little import, considering that he never returned from his hike. And the truth being Prab's fate has remained a mystery ever since. Police managed to speak to a handful of other hikers who were also present on the main range trail that morning. They reported that the day had started off with some pleasant and sunny weather and no significant change was expected. All in all, a perfect day for hiking. However, by about noon, the temperature on the trail had dropped significantly and a raging blizzard had hit the area at lightning speed. The blizzard dumped a massive 30 centimeters of snow onto the ground in places and reduced visibility so much that at times it was only possible to see a couple of feet in front of you. Over 15th and May 16th, the Juicy rental company attempted to contact Probst several times to tell them that he was overdue in returning the van, but obviously the calls weren't answered. On 18th, the caretaker at Charlotte Pass became concerned after the van had been there for 4 days with no evidence of any activity in the fresh snow. When he looked closer, he found that the van only had a 1-day entry pass dated the May 14th. This was obviously a huge red flag, so the caretaker contacted Juicy, who informed him that they had been unable to contact the individual who had rented the van. Suspecting someone might well be in danger, the caretaker immediately called the police to report what he had found. Later that same day, police tried to get in contact with rental car company's head office over in neighboring New Zealand. Yet due to the difference in time zones, all they got was an answering machine. The next day, with the situation becoming critical, police managed to establish that Prop was missing and moved to notify his family back in Canada. A small-scale search then commenced with 2 national parks and wildlife service rangers scouring the general area in which Prop had gone missing. Police also attempted to triangulate the signal from his cell phone, but due to the phone being off the Vodafone grid for over 3 days, they found they were unable to do so. Then on May 20th, a full-blown state emergency service search began with 2 helicopters and around 50 search and rescue personnel on foot, ski, and ski-doo. 2 days later, a report came in that 2 national parks and wildlife service employees who were performing maintenance work on a mountain survival shelter heard what they believed to be an adult male's voice crying out for assistance. Deducing that the cries were coming from an area north of the shelter, rangers attempted to track down whoever was calling out. But almost as soon as they set off, the cries ceased and the rangers failed to make any meaningful contact. A low-flying helicopter then patrolled over the area hoping to see what the rangers had been unable to, but still nothing was found. Later on, a man skiing in an area known as Little Austria reported that he too had heard a voice coming from the same direction at around the same time. Yet, despite the cooperation, solid intelligence was no substitute for an actual physical find. A full 11 days after Prab had gone missing, the police requested that Vodafone set up 2 portable repeater stations, one at the trailhead of the main range track at Charlotte Pass where Prop had parked his car, and one near the peak of Mount Kosciuszko. 5 days later, on May 30th, Vodafone provided information to police that the pings from Prob's mobile phone plotted a course where he was walking quickly, following the main range track anti-clockwise, and then left the track towards Mount Townsend before losing contact with his phone somewhere on the northwest side of Mount Townsend. Private investigators hired by the Schramm family were convinced that they were closing in on Prop's position and urged the family not to give up. But following advice from a doctor specializing in survivability, it was believed that considering Prob had not attempted to contact anyone, he would have most likely perished after 14 days at the very latest, considering the climate and the terrain. After hearing this, police drastically scaled the search efforts back, although they too advised the Proud family not to give up hope until the worst news had been confirmed. And so began a privately funded search in which the Prob family offered a $100,000 as a reward for any information which led to Prob being recovered. In an effort to aid the search for Prob in the Blue Mountains, a $250 daily rate was offered to members of the public for their assistance. This drew a variety of people, some motivated by the reward and others driven by the desire to do the right thing. Among those who joined the search were a group of Canadian soldiers, who vowed to do everything they could to help bring their fellow soldier home. As July arrived, the Australian winter set in, bringing heavy snow that severely hindered the search efforts. After spending over $200,000 on private investigators, the Schramm family had no choice but to call off the search. In September 2013, the financial reward for finding Prob, dead or alive, was officially withdrawn. A couple of small police searches were carried out toward the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, when the snow melted and the summer conditions allowed for better visibility. Despite these final attempts, no trace of Prab was ever discovered. 2 years later, in June 2015, Prab was officially declared dead following a coroner's inquest into his disappearance. The coroner concluded that he had died from exposure on the day he set out, having been caught unprepared in a blizzard somewhere on the northwest face of Mount Townsend. Despite no physical evidence ever being found, his family continues to hold on to hope, believing that miracles do happen and that one day he might be found alive. However, this misplaced hope only adds to the heartbreak, as the chilling reality remains that a young, well-trained, perfectly healthy man may have lost his life due to one of nature's unpredictable forces. And if something like this could claim someone like Prab, it makes you realize just how vulnerable the rest of us truly are. I work part-time at a gas station in my city. It's located on the edge of town, near the suburbs, and it's a pretty standard gas station. Nothing too creepy or isolated. I chose to work here because rent prices were rising, and my other job wasn't covering all my expenses. The only shift I could take around my other job was overnight, and gas stations are one of the few places that offer those shifts. This happened about 10 months ago. It was a cold night, and there was still some snow on the ground from a heavy snowfall a few days earlier. Other than that, everything was pretty typical. Since the station is in the suburbs, there's not a lot of traffic, just a few cars passing by every hour. By midnight, only a handful of cars had come in for fuel. After a while, I got bored and left the front desk to walk around the shop, organizing the shelves to pass the time. A couple of minutes later, I heard the door open. I turned around to see a man walking in, heading straight for the front desk. He leaned over the counter, looking both ways, almost like he was searching for someone to help him. "Can I help you with something?" I asked as I made my way back to the counter. The man turned to face me, looking almost startled, then hesitated before replying, "No, I'm good," and walked back out. It was clear he needed help with something, but seeing him act like that made me wonder if he was plotting a robbery. I work at a gas station after all, so the possibility was always on my mind. I watched him leave and noticed he walked to a car parked in a strange spot, near the pumps but not in the parking section. He got in and drove off. I wasn't sure if he was planning something, but everything about the situation screamed that he might be. I thought maybe me being behind the counter instead of at the door had thrown him off and made him back off. Still, I was pretty sure this was an attempted robbery, so I called the police to report it, just in case they planned to hit another gas station. They told me an officer would be there in a couple of minutes, so I hung up and waited. But not even a minute later, that same car pulled back into the parking lot. They parked in the same spot again and just sat there with the engine running. I could see some movement in the front seats. There were at least 2 people in there. I quickly locked the front doors and braced myself for whatever might happen. I kept watching, but the car just stayed there, no one getting out, as if they were waiting for the right moment. Thankfully, the police arrived and immediately recognized the car based on my description. They pulled in behind it, blocking them in. To my surprise, there wasn't much of a scene. The officer walked up and pulled 2 men out of the car, one of which was the guy who had come in earlier. They tried to act like they weren't up to anything, but that didn't fool anyone. While it seemed obvious they were planning to rob the place, what the police found in their car was even worse. In the trunk, there was a stash of weapons, rope, tape, and other disturbing items. Both men were arrested, but I'm still shaken knowing what they had in their car. If I hadn't reported them after that strange interaction, I could have ended up in a much worse situation. Maybe never seen again after that night. I work as a delivery driver for my local Papa John's. Since I'm in college, it's one of the few job options I could fit into my schedule. A few of my friends work there too, but since we're all delivery drivers, we rarely cross paths even when we're on the same shifts. This happened last December while I was picking up some extra hours before Christmas. That night, it was snowing quite heavily, making deliveries take longer than usual. On top of that, the number of orders was higher than usual. I never really got too stressed about work, but working nonstop for hours was definitely not as fun. At 9:30, I grabbed my next orders and got in my car to start the drive. I had 2 deliveries to make, both about 5 minutes apart from each other, but they were quite far from the shop, around 15 minutes away, which in this weather felt more like 25 minutes. The first part of the drive was typical, but as I went on, the route started taking me into the less traveled part of town. The houses here were old, and many of the shops had closed down. It wasn't an area people passed through unless they lived there, since it was outdated and not exactly up to modern standards. After 20 minutes of driving, I pulled into one of the neighborhoods and drove down the road toward the first house. The road was empty. No cars lined the street, and many of the houses appeared vacant. When I reached the first address, I parked on the road and walked up to the front door. An elderly man answered, paid for the pizzas, and I returned to the car to set the directions for the next stop. This house was still in the same neighborhood, but as I drove, I realized the route was taking me deeper into the area, further away from the main part of town. The houses became more spread out, and soon there were hardly any houses around. By the time I arrived at the address, I was surrounded by trees. Once again, I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. I knocked and waited on the porch, but it was so cold out, and the wet snow was making my clothes damp and uncomfortable. After a minute, the door opened. A middle-aged woman stood there, looking like she'd just woken up. Her hair was messy, and she had tired, empty eyes. "I have your order for 2 pizzas," I said, holding the boxes out and giving her the total. She took the boxes, placed them on a table next to her, and then told me to wait while she got the cash. Another minute passed before the door opened again. She started going through some bills, counting them slowly and trying to add them up. There was definitely something off about her. It's hard to explain, but everything she did felt strange. Then, as if counting the cash wasn't difficult enough for her, she began making small talk. Normal things like asking how my day was going and other casual conversation. I responded politely, but something about the situation felt off, like she was stalling. While she continued talking, I glanced back at my car, needing a moment to distance myself from the weirdness. That's when I saw a man standing right next to it. He was peering into the windows and messing with the door. When I looked back at the woman, her expression had shifted into pure anger. Clicked, but it was too late. She reached out and grabbed me, shouting to the man by my car. He turned and started running toward us, while the woman tried to drag me inside the house. I pushed her off and broke free. My instincts kicked in and I bolted toward the trees. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crunching through the snow behind me as I ran through the forest. They eventually started to fade away. After about 2 minutes of running, I stopped to catch my breath. Thankfully, the moonlight was bright enough to guide me through the woods and out to one of the streets in the neighborhood. Once I had service, I called 911, and after what felt like an eternity in the cold, an officer finally showed up. Another patrol car went to the house and found the man outside, trying to break into my car. To make a long story short, the motive was likely that the couple had run out of money and decided to rob my vehicle. The whole situation had been a distraction so the man could steal from me without me noticing. But since I saw what he was doing, it's unclear what their plan was next. Maybe they would have just let me go, but it's obvious I would have reported them, so I don't think they were planning on letting me off that easy. I'm just grateful I got away unharmed and that I was their first victim before they got caught and arrested, preventing them from doing any more harm to anyone else. A few New Year's Eves ago, a close friend of mine became the victim of a terrible crime. Normally, she would join me and some of our other friends to celebrate the new year, but that year, she accepted an invitation to a different party from one of her coworkers. I was concerned when she told me about it, mainly because she had a tendency to drink too much and lose control. She reassured me not to worry, as she'd be with her new boyfriend. This didn't exactly calm my nerves. There was something about him that always made me uneasy, but I kept my worries to myself. To ease my mind, she promised to call me when she got home from the party, and I agreed without hesitation. My other two friends came over to another friend's house, who hosted a yearly New Year's party. It was a well-planned and fun night, as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease about my other friend's safety. I kept checking my watch, waiting for her call. Around 2 a.m., I got back home and expected her call any minute. After grabbing a small bottle of Gatorade, my personal hangover remedy, I curled up on the couch, bracing for the inevitable. Around 4:15 a.m., I was awakened by my phone ringing. I must have dozed off waiting for her call, still lying on the couch. Sleepily, I answered the phone, lightly scolding her for taking so long to reach out. But the voice on the other end wasn't hers. It was a woman, informing me that my friend had been dropped off at the ER, suffering from alcohol poisoning. I quickly thanked her for reaching out and rushed to my car. When I got to the hospital, nurses and doctors were still working on her. One of them took me aside. That was when I learned how she had arrived at the hospital. From what the staff could tell, she had been driven there and left at the ER's automatic doors. One of the staff had noticed the doors opening and closing repeatedly, and when they went to investigate, they found her unconscious body lying on the ground. My mind was filled with a storm of questions and frustration, but that wasn't the end of the bad news. Another member of the team working on her had found a pair of what they believed to be her own panties stuffed in the front pocket of her skirt. The underwear were ripped and torn like they had been yanked from her body. Since she was now very suspicious that my friend had been assaulted, she examined her closer and found bruising and blood in her private area. The police were notified, and they used a kit to investigate further. During the procedure, male fluids were discovered. For a moment, I was about to ask her why she was telling me this. Surely, there was privacy laws in place, but then I remember that I was listed as her next of kin. All the blood members of her family had died in the Balkans War of 1990s, as if she could read my thoughts. She said that she wouldn't normally tell another person a patient's private information, but under the circumstances, it seemed necessary. I was confused by the word circumstances and asked what she meant. She then told me that my friend's condition was very serious, and she might not live. The words "may not live" gutted me, and I collapsed to the floor and began bawling my eyes out. The nurse helped me up and led me into a private area so I could get myself together. The time eventually came when there was nothing more the staff could do for her, and she remained in a coma for several days. When the time came for her to pass, I was with her, and it didn't appear she suffered. By this time, I'd come to the conclusion that her death was probably for the better. I don't think she would have been able to deal with the news of her assault. Things had a way of eating at her that I don't think it would have on anyone else I knew. It likely went back to her childhood in Bosnia, and I think some things happened that she didn't talk about and led to her issues with alcohol. Although I'd come to terms with her death, I still wanted some answers. I tracked down her so-called boyfriend, the ahole that went with her to the party. He acted as if though her death was no big deal, which made me even angrier. I did all I could do to control myself while I spoke to him. When it came to the question of why he left her at the party, he said she was acting kind of like a hoe. This was the last straw, and I slapped him as hard as I could. The look of shock on his face made me chuckle, but after that I was asked to leave by his boss. My next goal was to track down the guy or the guys that assaulted her. I had tried to get in contact with the police to get some information as to if they were pursuing the investigation, but I continually got the runaround. One officer even told me that any charges were unlikely because of her death. Whether they were going to do anything or not, I was determined to track down that person. 3 years have passed since her death, and I'm still no closer to finding him. I've talked to several party attendees and come up with very little. However, as long as I'm physically able, I'm going to continue my search. As far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't be a real friend if I didn't. They say the walls have ears, but in that secluded cabin, it was the eyes I had to worry about. Hidden cameras turned what was supposed to be a peaceful getaway into a claustrophobic nightmare. I learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones you invite into your life. I'd been dreaming of this vacation for months. The pressure of my high-stress job in the city had been wearing me thin, and the idea of a week alone in a cozy cabin, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, seemed like the perfect escape. When I found the listing online for a rustic retreat tucked away in the heart of the Adirondacks, I didn't think twice about booking it. The drive up was beautiful, the road winding through increasingly dense forest. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to melt away. It was picture perfect. An old log cabin with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. The owner, a friendly older man named John, was waiting to greet me. "Welcome to your home away from home," he said with a warm smile, handing me the keys. "Everything you need should be inside. If you need anything, I'm just a phone call away. Enjoy your stay." I thanked him and watched as he drove away, leaving me alone in the growing twilight. The silence was immediate and absolute. No car horns, no sirens, no chatter from the crowds. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional bird call. I breathed deeply, savoring the pine-scented air. The interior of the cabin was just as charming as the outside, rustic furniture, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking the forest. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and start unwinding. That first evening was blissful. I cooked a simple meal, opened a bottle of wine, and curled up with a book by the fire. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt more peaceful than I had in years. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore the surrounding woods. I spent hours hiking, marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. When I returned to the cabin, pleasantly tired and hungry, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the space felt different somehow. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just city dweller paranoia. But as I moved around the cabin, the feeling persisted. It was as if the very air had changed, charged with an unseen presence. That's when I saw it. A small, dark spot on the bookshelf, just above eye level. At first, I thought it was just a knot in the wood, but as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. It was a camera lens, barely visible but unmistakable to my trained eyes. My heart racing, I began to search the cabin more thoroughly. In the bedroom, I found another camera hidden in the smoke detector. The bathroom had one tucked into the vent. Even the kitchen wasn't safe. A tiny lens peered out from inside the clock on the wall. Panic set in as the reality of my situation became clear. I was being watched. Every moment of privacy, every intimate act had been recorded. But by whom and why? My first instinct was to run, to jump in my car and drive as fast and as far as I could. But as I looked out the window at the darkening sky and the dense forest beyond, I realized I had no idea where I was. In my excitement for a secluded getaway, I hadn't paid much attention to the route we'd taken. My phone had no signal here, and I hadn't seen another house for miles. I was trapped. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to think rationally. Whoever had placed these cameras clearly didn't want me to know about them. As long as I pretended everything was normal, I might be safe until I could figure out a plan. So I went through the motions of my evening routine, all the while my mind racing. Was it John, the friendly owner, or was someone else watching? Someone who had accessed the cabin without his knowledge? That night was the longest of my life. I lay in bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every noise a potential intruder. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I made my decision. I had to get out. No matter what, I packed my bags as quietly as possible, trying to act normal in case someone was watching the live feed. Just as I was about to open the front door, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My heart leaped into my throat. Someone was here. Through the peephole, I saw John's truck pulling up. He stepped out, carrying a bag of groceries, that same friendly smile on his face. But now, knowing what I knew, that smile seemed sinister, predatory. I opened the door, forcing a smile of my own. "John, what a surprise." "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Thought I'd bring you some fresh supplies. How are you enjoying your stay?" The casual tone, the normalcy of it all, made my skin crawl. Did he know that I knew? Was this all part of some sick game? It's been great, I lied, my voice surprisingly steady. But actually, I just got a call from work. Emergency. I have to head back to the city immediately. John's smile faltered for just a moment. A flicker of something, disappointment, anger, crossing his face. Oh, that's a shame. Are you sure you can't stay? The weather report says there's a storm coming in. Might not be safe to drive. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. He didn't want me to leave. I'm sure, I said firmly, gesturing to my packed bags. Thanks for everything. But I really must go. For a long moment, we stood there, the tension palpable. I was acutely aware of how isolated we were, how easily things could turn violent. My car keys felt heavy in my pocket, my only chance at escape. Finally, John's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, if you must, drive safely. I nodded, skirting around him to my car. Every step felt like a mile, my back tingling with the certainty that at any moment, he might lunge at me. But somehow, miraculously, I made it to the car. As I pulled away, I saw John in my rearview mirror, standing on the porch, watching me go. I didn't breathe easily until the cabin disappeared from view. Once I hit the main road, I drove straight to the nearest police station. The officers were skeptical at first, hidden cameras, a creepy cabin owner. It sounded far-fetched, but something in my demeanor, the raw fear in my voice, convinced them to investigate. What they found chilled me to the bone. Not only were there cameras throughout the cabin, but there was a hidden room filled with monitors, recording equipment, and files on previous guests. John, it turned out, had been running this scheme for years, selling the footage to the darkest corners of the internet. The investigation uncovered a network of similar operations spanning multiple states. My discovery had exposed a vast voyeuristic crime ring. In the months that followed, as the case made its way through the courts, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. I jumped at unexpected noises, felt exposed in my own home, and couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Therapy helped, along with the support of friends and family, but the experience had left a mark on me that would never fully fade. I saw the world differently now, always searching for hidden threats, never completely trusting appearances. It was a harsh lesson in how darkness can hide behind friendly smiles and beautiful facades. The peaceful cabin in the woods, once a symbol of relaxation and escape, had become a nightmare that followed me into the waking world. But over time, I found an unexpected strength in what I had endured. I had faced one of my greatest fears and survived. I had trusted my instincts, fought back, and helped bring down a criminal enterprise. Slowly, I began to reclaim my life. I learned to enjoy solitude again and find peace in quiet moments. But I never again took privacy for granted. In hotel rooms, vacation rentals, even in my own home, I was always aware, always vigilant. The world I had come to know was full of hidden eyes. But now, mine were wide open too. And in that awareness, I found not just fear, but power. The power to protect myself, to trust my instincts, and to never again be an unwitting victim. As I sit here now, writing this story, I can't help but glance around, checking for that familiar glint of a lens. It's a habit I may never break, but I'm no longer paralyzed by fear. Instead, I'm driven by a determination to live fully and freely, to not let the darkness win. Because in the end, the most important eyes watching me are my own. And what they see is a survivor, stronger and wiser for having faced the hidden horrors that can lurk in even the most idyllic retreats. I first noticed him on my walk home. It was late, the streets damp from an earlier rain. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows through the thick fog that had rolled in off the river. The air smelled of wet pavement and something else, something I couldn't place. At first, I thought I was alone. Then I saw him, a figure standing at the far end of the street, barely visible through the mist. He wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I stopped walking. My pulse quickened. The fog swirled, thickening for just a second, and when it thinned again, he was closer. I turned on my heel and walked faster. By the time I reached my building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced back before stepping inside. The street was empty, but the fog seemed heavier, denser, as if something was still hiding in it. I locked the door behind me. That night, I woke up to the sound of static. At first, I thought it was my television, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from outside, from the street. I peered out my window, my breath fogging against the glass. The street was swallowed in mist, and standing beneath the nearest streetlight was the figure. Closer now, still motionless, still watching. The static grew louder. I stepped away from the window. My skin crawled. The noise buzzed in my ears, drilling into my skull. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. And then, silence. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the fog, my overtired mind playing games with me. But as I left for work, I noticed something on my front step. Footprints, not made by shoes, bare footprints, large, uneven, leading up to my door. They were wet, like someone had stepped out of the river and walked straight to my building. I never heard them knock. I never heard them leave. That night, the fog returned. I locked every door, closed every curtain. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard it again. The static, a faint humming buzz growing louder and louder. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, forcing myself not to move. Then, from outside my window, a breath, slow, heavy. I turned my head, just slightly. The curtains weren't fully shut, and in the narrow gap, just beyond the glass, I saw him. His face was inches from mine, separated only by the thin pane of glass. Smiling, his lips stretched too wide, too thin, his eyes dark pools of nothingness. Then the lights flickered, the static roared, and the fog swallowed everything whole. The next morning, I found my phone lying on the floor. The screen was on, displaying a video, a recording from outside my building. The footage was shaky, distorted, the timestamp blinking erratically. The camera panned to the front steps. The fog was thick, swirling like something alive. Then movement, a figure emerging, slowly stepping forward. The same figure. Its arms hung stiffly at its sides. Its head twitched, jerking toward the camera, though its face remained blurred, shifting in and out of focus. Then, just before the video cut to static, the figure raised one hand and waved. I deleted the video, smashed the phone against the floor, packed my bags without thinking, without questioning. But as I rushed to my door, heart hammering in my chest, I hesitated, because beyond the peephole, just barely visible through the thickening fog, something was waiting, and this time it was inside. This happened about 11 months ago, just after my wife, Diana, and I got married in June. I'll never be more grateful for the habit of locking doors. Our wedding day was winding down, and family and friends were slowly leaving. Diana and I were still chatting with some of the guests who stayed behind a little longer, and everything was going great. It was a day filled with fond memories. But the night took an unexpected turn as we were on our way to our honeymoon. At around 9 p.m., we said goodbye to the last of our guests, got into the car, and headed home. We had our bags packed for Cancun, and we were excited to leave. Since we live in Washington and flying out of Seattle's SeaTac Airport wasn't the most affordable option, we decided it was cheaper to drive up north to Canada and fly out from there. Plus, we thought it would be fun to have a mini road trip to Canada before flying to Cancun. It was only a 3.5-hour drive, so we headed out at around 12 a.m. The drive was great. We had music blasting, talking excitedly about Cancun and the new chapter of our lives. Diana started to drift off, exhausted from the wedding. By the time we were halfway to Canada, we were in a more secluded area, fewer cars and fewer people, and it was getting pretty quiet. It was around 3 a.m. We had some time to spare, and I was starting to feel sleepy too, so I pulled over to a gas station to grab a Red Bull. It was completely empty, so I parked the car and saw Diana still asleep. I told her I'd take the keys and lock her in while I ran inside for a minute. She motioned like she heard me but was too tired to respond. I came back about 6 minutes later, and what I saw shocked me. Diana was shaking and crying. I was immediately confused and started freaking out, not sure why she was upset. She couldn't even speak at first, but after she calmed down, she told me what had happened. Apparently, she did hear me tell her I had the keys and would be right back. While she was asleep, she woke up to a tapping on the driver's side window. Too tired to open her eyes or get up, she lazily reached for the unlock button, thinking it was me. But then a thought crossed her mind. Asterisk, didn't he say he had the keys? Why would he need me to unlock the door? Asterisk. That's when she heard a woman's voice mumbling from outside the window. Diana turned to look and saw a woman with long black hair, wide eyes, and a crooked smile. She couldn't hear what the woman was saying at first, but as she listened closely, she heard the woman repeatedly ask, "Are you tired?" in a mumbled tone. Terrified, Diana told the woman to leave her alone, but the woman just laughed and responded that she was tired too. The woman never took her eyes off Diana and even tried the door handle a couple of times. Diana, close to tears, tried calling me, but she realized I had left my phone in the car. Feeling like she had no other options, Diana started honking the horn to maybe scare the woman off and get my attention. But the woman still stared at her, mumbling and laughing while trying the door handle again. Then the woman asked, "Do you know Sarah?" and kept mumbling something about her. After a few more minutes, the woman eventually walked away. Diana said that the second the woman left, I came out of the gas station. Diana broke down in relief. I still don't know how I didn't hear the car horn, and I feel terrible about leaving my phone in the car. What bothered Diana the most, though, was that the woman didn't look homeless or dirty. She looked completely normal, well-kept, but with a chilling gaze and that unsettling smile. What really shakes me is thinking about what could have happened if Diana hadn't remembered that I had the keys, or if she had opened the door without realizing I had locked her in. I still don't know what the woman's intentions were, but I'm sure if I couldn't hear the horn, there's no way I would have heard any screams. When I was at university, I got really involved in one of the musical theater societies. They would put on one big show and one smaller one every year, and in my first year, I landed the lead role in the larger production. I was nervous since this was my first big role ever, but people reassured me, saying it wasn't a big deal and that most people wouldn't pay nearly as much attention to me as I thought they would. I wish that had been the case. We had a week-long run in a fairly large venue with about 300 seats. Opening night went smoothly, and everything was going well, but things took a turn the next day. My university had a Facebook page where people would post love letters. It usually had a mix of genuine confessions and just silly jokes. On that page, someone posted something along the lines of, "To the girl who played my character's name, last night you were very cute. I wish your costume was just a bit shorter though." A few people I knew tagged me in it. The second half of the comment made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off, assuming it was just a friend playing a harmless prank. We had our second show, and there's a part where I have to point someone out in the audience. That night, I chose a guy sitting in the second row. Later that same evening, another post appeared on the confession page. This time, it used my real name, Annie. "Thanks for pointing me out tonight. You made me blush." It was signed with the name of my character's love interest. Again, I wasn't sure if I felt flattered or not, so I just decided to ignore it. The third day of shows was uneventful, but on our fourth day, I saw the same guy in the audience. It made me a bit uncomfortable that he'd come to see it for the third time, so I ignored him even though he was near the front of the audience again, meaning he'd have to be one of the first people to arrive. Then our promotional Twitter started getting posts from an account run by a person who was obviously the same guy based on the profile pic, asking if we did stage door and if he could catch the cast after the show. At that point, everybody knew and agreed he was being a bit creepy, and one of my friends, Jordan, who happened to be playing my love interest, offered to walk me home after the shows. This seemed okay for a day or two until curiosity got the better of me and I decided to check this guy's Twitter, which was private. His Tumblr was linked in his description, however, and that wasn't. And geez, I'm so glad I did because they were incredibly creepy. There was a whole bunch of stuff he'd reblogged about unrequited love and some posts that were definitely about me. Stuff like I'm her biggest fan and she doesn't even know I exist in the notes. I don't quite remember everything because it was a while ago, but he seemed to be under some kind of delusion that I was my character and that he was the love interest. It was really weird and I was super creeped out. It all came to a peak during one of our last shows. Basically, we have two entrances on stage, but there's a bit where I have to come in from the back of the audience. Meaning I basically have to go around the entire theater from backstage. I have to leave the building for a bit. I have a scene to spare, so I was going around when I catch someone walking behind me. I turned around and the very same guy is there. He asked me if he can take a picture with me that he was supposed to catch the show. But he was late, so he waited for me to come out. I tell him that I have to go on stage soon. But that's nice of him, even though I didn't think that at all. I started to leave and he calls after me, yelling at me as if I'm my character. He straight up said some lines that Jordan's character does and said to wait until after the show where he'll rescue me from the fake love interest. This definitely set off alarm bells, so I just sit back into the building and tell my stage manager as soon as possible. They must have alerted on campus security guards because he was gone after the show. I haven't seen him since. I've graduated since, and I think he got scared off. Still, I'm very upset that he ruined what should have been a fun show week, and I'm slightly worried about him. I don't know if the delusion was an act or he genuinely believed it, and if it was the latter, I hope he got help. This happened when I was around 10 years old. I live in a relatively small country, and it only took a couple of hours to drive from my house to my aunt's place in another county. The story starts with my mom and I driving home from my aunt's house. We were on a country road when we noticed a battered minivan in front of us as we approached a roundabout. We were the only two cars on the road. The back window of the minivan had gardening tools and a tarp in it, and it was clear the driver was either drunk or just a complete idiot. They kept swerving in and out of their lane like they were in some kind of video game, like a reckless protagonist. It was a hot day, so both of our cars had the windows down, and we could hear what sounded like a sermon blasting from their radio. We followed the minivan for about 7 minutes, with my mom muttering about the state of the country. Suddenly, the minivan came to a stop in the middle of the road, which really annoyed my mom. The driver then did an illegal U-turn, and during that, two things happened. I saw the driver's face. He was a skinny, middle-aged man with dirty yellow hair and a beard, and we both got a good look at each other's license plates. The driver turned into the opposite lane, driving past us while still swerving dangerously, almost hitting our car. After he drove off, my mom pulled over and called the police to report him, giving them his license plate and a description of what he looked like. The cop thanked us and promised to take care of it. When we were almost home, my mom got a call from the police, who informed her that they had arrested the man, who had warrants for drug dealing and domestic abuse. My mom was thanked for her help, and we joked about her being a hero over pizza that night. A few weeks later, after school had started again, I went with my dad to the hardware store. While my dad was at the checkout, I was looking out the window when I saw the battered minivan driving out of the parking lot. I couldn't see the driver, so I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, but my dad noticed that I seemed uneasy for the rest of the night. A few days later, my mom came home early from work looking like she had just ran a marathon. She gave me and my brothers tight hugs, and we were sent to bed earlier than usual that night. I didn't learn about this next part until last year. The reason my mom was acting so weird is because her secretary had reported seeing a strange man inspecting the license plates of my mom's car. My mom asked what the man looked like and froze when she was given the description of the guy we had reported. That weekend, my mom didn't want any of us kids leaving the house, but I was a stubborn little broad and all but demanded to be allowed out for a quick walk around the neighborhood. While I was out in roughly 15 minutes walk away from my house, a vehicle drove past me. It was the minivan, and the same man was in the driver's seat, giving me a friendly nod. As soon as he was out of sight, I ran back home and told my parents, who immediately bundled all of us into my dad's car and drove to stay the night at Grandma's. I was put in the guest room, but had zero chance of falling asleep, so I was wide awake for all the drama that happened that night. My parents called the cops and informed them about the man stalking us. A couple of hours later, a squad car pulled up outside and the officers told my parents everything. When they arrived to our house, they had discovered the front door had been forced open. Some of our nicest possessions had been smashed and were left in shards on the floor, and that's not the worst part. The worst part was where the police found the man, in the pantry, holding what a female officer described as the biggest knife she had ever seen. My husband and I were on vacation and decided to stay at a bed and breakfast in Vermont. It was in a very rural area, but absolutely beautiful. The place seemed very old, and it was run by an elderly couple who were so kind and pleasant. We arrived around 7 p.m. and were starving. The elderly man who showed us to our honeymoon suite offered to make us dinner. We told him he didn't need to, but he insisted, and since we were really hungry, we didn't argue too much. He made us red potatoes, chicken fried steak, and toast. After eating, we sat with him and his wife and chatted. We asked them about the place and how long they had been running it. They told us they owned it. They asked where we were from and what the occasion was. They were so kind, but in the middle of our conversation, we saw a man exit the bathroom down the hall, which was visible from where we were sitting. He stomped a few doors down to what I assumed was his room. He seemed upset, maybe on drugs, and was grunting as he walked. The elderly couple just smiled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. It was like they were familiar with the man and just dealing with him. I wanted to ask about him, but I didn't want to make things worse and make them feel more uncomfortable. Later that night, as my husband and I lay in bed talking, we heard a faint voice coming from the room next to ours. It sounded like a man saying, "Not again." I thought it was a man's voice, but my husband thought it was a woman's. Then we heard what sounded like a big piece of furniture being moved around the room. A few hours later, while we were asleep, I was shaken awake by my husband. He told me he had heard someone gasp in the room next door, and it sounded like they were in some kind of trouble. He said it wasn't the room we had heard the noise from earlier, but the room on the other side of ours. I told him he should call the front desk, but when he tried, no one picked up the phone. He got dressed and went down to the front of the building to speak with the elderly couple. He was gone for about 10 minutes, then came back saying no one was there. He said he even checked the back kitchen, but it was empty. About 20 minutes after he returned to our room, we heard someone walking down the hallway. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. Thankfully, the door was locked, but the person tried to open it. My husband yelled, "Occupied," in a stern voice. The person then walked away and headed towards the stairs. We finally went back to sleep and woke up around 9 a.m. We packed our stuff and went downstairs, expecting to see the elderly couple. But when we entered the back kitchen, we found something very disturbing. In the sink were white rags that looked like they had blood on them. We continued to look around, and eventually, my husband opened a closet and found a mop bucket with thick, red water in it. At that point, I freaked out. I knew something was very wrong. We walked around the whole place and never saw anyone again. Eventually, we left some money on the back kitchen counter and a note and left. The rest of our vacation was normal, I guess you could say. But when we hit our next stop, we called the police and told them that they should check out that bed and breakfast. They told us they would, but we never got a call back. We never found out what happened until we got home. A few days after we arrived at our house, police were at our door questioning us about our stay at that bed and breakfast. We were told that the elderly couple were brutally murdered and their bodies were dismembered. The woman was found in the room next to ours, chopped up, and her husband was found in the room on the other side. His body had been dragged to the bathroom, and his body had been cut up in the bathtub. I was sick upon hearing this. We had to go take a polygraph test, but our story and willingness to cooperate excluded us from possible suspects. Months passed, and I would often inquire about it and call the police, asking if they had found who did it. Eventually, they had, We learned that the man that was staying at the place, the one that walked out of the bathroom that night, had committed the crimes. We haven't gone on vacation since. At 19, I moved out for the first time with my old friend, Nathan. We rented a 2-bedroom basement apartment for a year. At first, everything was great. It felt like having a never-ending sleepover with my best friend. And since we worked opposite shifts, we had plenty of time alone in the apartment. I worked a retail job during the day, while Nathan worked overnights. For the first couple of months, things were smooth. Nathan would be working and I'd be at home, or vice versa. Sometimes, when our schedules aligned, we'd stay up late playing video games together. The first thing that struck me as odd was the closet in my bedroom. The master bedroom had a small walk-in closet, and I noticed that the carpet in the corners seemed like it had been dug out by an animal. There were also several gaps in the walls where the carpet met the edge. At first, I thought it was just typical apartment wear and tear, nothing to be alarmed about. It didn't scare me right away. I just assumed maybe someone had a dog, and it left a mess, so I let it be. But then, the strange occurrences started piling up. I would hear Nathan calling my name, only to realize that he'd been at work for hours. The hallway leading to our bedrooms always made us feel uneasy. The hallway light would often stay on, and we joked it was just a childhood fear of the dark. But the weird part was we would both occasionally think we saw the other person walking out of the hallway, only to find we were alone. More than once, I had a friend sleep over, and they'd complain about being kept awake by the constant flickering of the hallway light. We tried to be respectful of each other's schedules. If I knew Nathan had just come home in the morning and was sleeping, I'd do my best to be quiet when I left for work. One morning, Nathan told me that while he was getting ready to sleep after his shift, he heard footsteps in the hallway and the door to my room shaking. At first, he thought it was just me rushing around, but then he realized I should have already been at work. He checked the time, and then, out of concern, he decided to check on me. When he opened his door and looked down the hallway toward my room, he froze. He said he saw a dark figure standing outside my door. At that moment, he convinced himself that it was just me, running late for work and embarrassed by being caught. So I ducked into my room. He went back to his room and didn't hear anything else for the rest of the day. When I came home later and confirmed that I hadn't been late that morning, he decided to ignore it. As time went on, both of us felt constantly irritable and exhausted. It became nearly impossible to get any rest, especially when I was alone in the apartment. Nathan would often chalk it up to me being nervous, being a woman alone at night. I would spend my nights curled up on the far end of the couch, wrapped in a blanket under the lamp. More than once, I ended up sleeping there, feeling it was safer than walking down that eerie hallway to my room. Then, one morning, I was jolted awake in bed by the sound of someone pounding on my bedroom door. My heart raced with fear. The banging was frantic, and I could see the door shaking under the force of it. Immediately, I thought the apartment had flooded, we had been robbed, or something had happened to Nathan. I leaped out of bed and ripped open my door, but once again, the hallway was silent and empty. Confused, I rushed down the hall to the main door and checked outside. There was no one there, just like before. I collapsed onto the couch in the living room, unable to shake the unease, even though I desperately wanted to go back to sleep. When I realized Nathan was home, I tried to convince myself that he had been sleepwalking. Later, he confessed that he'd had recurring nightmares that morning, but he didn't think he had actually been walking in his sleep. His room was tiny, and he had a weight set that took up most of the space, so getting in and out of his room required him to crawl over it. I also realized that, based on the time it took for me to open the door, he would have had to sprint back to his room and slam the door shut to avoid me noticing. As bizarre as that was, things took a much darker turn. Nathan and I had had an argument before he left for work, and I had been lying in bed, still upset, watching videos on my phone to try and fall asleep. Nathan worked overnight shifts, and his job was close enough that he'd come home for lunch around 3 a.m. most nights. When I heard the door creak open at that hour, I wasn't worried at first. I could hear the usual sounds of him moving around the apartment, opening cabinets, walking around. I rolled over, irritated that he was being louder than usual, and my stomach dropped. Nathan always turned on the hallway light when he came home. It was reassuring to see the light seep through the door frame, letting me know that I wasn't alone anymore. But tonight, when I rolled over, the light was gone. The room was pitch black. My heartbeat sped up as panic started to settle in. I texted Nathan to ask if he had come home, but I got no response. I strained my ears, and the sounds that reached me were nothing like normal. There were footsteps running around the apartment, coming down the hall to my door and then running away. Doors opened and closed. Cabinets creaked. In that moment, I was convinced we were being robbed. I shook with fear, unsure how to handle this. The noise outside my door sounded frantic and chaotic. I grabbed a knife that I kept under my pillow, knowing I couldn't call 911 quietly enough to protect myself. My instincts told me to fight and deal with whatever consequences came later. I stood behind the door, listening to the footsteps come closer, bracing myself. When the sounds began to fade down the hall, I yanked open the door, hoping to surprise whoever was out there. But the hallway was empty, silent and dark. I stared down the black corridor, certain they were hiding from me. Frozen, I waited, my gaze fixed on the space at the end of the hall. The front door was still in clear view from where I stood. It was shut. Whoever was there had to still be inside. I scanned the hallway and saw something that made my stomach drop. A large, dark figure peeking around the corner at the end of the hall. Without thinking, I charged down the hallway and turned the corner, ready to confront whoever was there. But there was no one. I flicked on all the lights and checked every room. The door was locked. All the windows were locked. Nathan's room was empty, and everything was in its place. The sounds of cabinets and drawers I had heard earlier were gone. All the tables were upright. As the adrenaline began to fade, I felt an unexpected calm wash over me. I pushed the terror to the back of my mind, locked my bedroom door, and went to bed, falling asleep almost instantly. To cope, my brain buried the memory deep down. It only resurfaced months later, after I had moved out, when Nathan and I finally shared our experiences. For the rest of my time in that apartment, the feelings of exhaustion and irritability persisted. Even the living room, my sanctuary, became compromised. I'd wake in the middle of the night to see a dark figure walking toward the couch, only for it to disappear when I looked. Things would fall over. I'd hear knocks at my bedroom door. More and more, I began to question my own sanity. Eventually, unable to handle the constant unease and with finances becoming tight, I decided to move back home. Within a month, I felt like myself again. We're still not entirely sure what was in that apartment, but we have some ideas. Before I get into those, though, I think it's important to share some context. Not long after moving in, I had started practicing Wicca. I'm not bringing this up to add a supernatural element, but to explain what we think happened. Early in my practice, I would fill my room with cleansing tools like quartz stones and sage to purify the space before performing spells and to maintain a certain energy in the room. We suspected whatever was haunting the apartment had originated in my closet. The ripped carpet and the small gaps in the walls, with things hidden just out of sight, made us think that whoever lived in my room before might have done something dark in there. We were too afraid of getting fined for damaging the apartment to pull up the carpet and see what might have been hidden underneath. Our theory is that I unknowingly pushed whatever darkness had been residing in that closet out, and it spent the rest of my time there trying to force its way back in. The longer it was kept out, the angrier it became, and that anger started to affect how we treated each other. When I moved out, things only got worse for Nathan, who stayed behind. He became perpetually exhausted, angry, and sank into a darker headspace. We think that once I left, the spirit or whatever was in that closet was able to re-enter my room. The girl who moved into my room after me said she was plagued by nightmares and that she was locked out of the room on several occasions, even though the door locked from the inside. She'd try it and it would be locked, but then later, when she tried again, the door would open. Nathan even sent me videos of doors opening on their own, and the TV displaying black and white static during DVDs and YouTube videos. My roommate eventually managed to move out, and both of us have been doing better since. Over time, Nathan and I shared more of what happened while we lived there, and we're both relieved to have come out of it okay. It definitely turned Nathan into a believer, especially since he'd been reluctant to acknowledge what was happening until his last few months in that apartment. Apartments are strange places. You never really know how many people have lived there before you, what they might have done, or what they may have left behind in the very space where you sleep at night. Maybe there really was something in that apartment, something lingering from whoever had been there before. Or maybe it was all just late nights, bad dreams, and misunderstandings. In the end, what you choose to believe is up to you. A bit of backstory. My great-grandmother's second husband was reportedly a complete sadist who abused her grandchildren for many years in nearly every way imaginable. These grandchildren happened to be my dad and his sisters, and as you can imagine, the effects were horrendous. This abuse was kept secret for years, only becoming known to others long after he died, which, by coincidence, was around the same time I was born. The impact of this abuse left a lasting mark on my family, shaping their collective psyche, making them hypervigilant to the point of paranoia when it came to protecting me from any similar fate. As a result, I was never allowed to play outside without strict supervision, and sleepovers were off-limits for me as a child. This story takes place in the early 90s when I was around 7 or 8 years old. My family had moved to Florida just as the holidays were approaching. We were a very close-knit family, largely due to the reasons I've mentioned. My Nana lived with us until the day she passed, and she was a huge part of my childhood. She helped around the house and with childcare, so whenever school was out or during holidays, she was always there to look after me when my parents were at work. I adored her with all my heart. She was the best Nana anyone could ask for, and tough as nails too. That year, I was lucky enough to get the one thing I had been desperately wishing for from Santa: a brand new pair of roller skates. I was obsessed with them. From the moment I got them, I couldn't wait to practice so I could skate faster and start nailing some tricks. One afternoon, I spent hours zooming up and down the sidewalk outside our house, getting better with each passing minute while Nana sat on the porch, keeping a watchful eye on me between reading her magazine or book. Then, at one point, the phone rang, and Nana had no choice but to step inside to answer it. She figured it might be my mom or dad letting her know they'd be staying late at work, or something important like that. She hesitated, knowing I'd fuss if I had to stop skating, even for a minute. But she probably thought she could answer the phone quickly without risking too much. So, she kept the main door open, making sure she could still see me through the screen door. Took her a minute or two to finish the call, but nothing strange happened during that time. I figured that gave her a bit of peace of mind, knowing she didn't have to worry about me constantly. When she gets back, she goes back to reading her thing while I was hard at work learning to spin on the spot or whatever trick I had my heart set on learning. Then after maybe another 45 minutes or so, she calls to me that it was time for a lemonade break and that we had to go inside. I remember begging her with everything I had to just please let me skate for just a little while longer. I managed to bargain with her somehow, telling her I'd skate just a few more minutes, but also swearing that I would come inside as soon as she made the lemonade. No ifs or buts. She kind of scowls at me for a second, probably silently cursing the fact that she couldn't quite say no to me whenever I begged her like that. But she eventually agreed before going inside to get the lemonade ready. But when she did, she tells me to sing as loud as I can so she can hear me from the kitchen and know that I was still there. So I did as I was told and warbled all the Boys to Men lyrics I knew while I continued to skate up and down. Then maybe only a few minutes goes by and I look up to see this big old van turn onto our street. It starts cruising along all slow, almost looking like they were lost or looking for something. But I mean, I didn't pay it any mind. I was a kid, naive, and besides I was too busy being happy with my skates to really consider any danger it might pose. And on top of that, I was with my tough old Nana and nothing could ever hurt me so long as she was around, or at least that's what I thought. So as it rolls up alongside me and slows to a stop, I just carry on trying my very best to twirl on the spot with my skates. In fact, knowing me, I probably tried to show off a little given I had an impromptu audience. The next thing I know, the passenger side of the van opens and a very, very tall man steps out. I know everyone is tall when you have yet to hit 10 years old, but this guy probably towered over all the other grown-ups he was around too. He was skinny to boot. He looked like a scarecrow and a skeleton's love child or something. Just all gangly limbs with a shock of salt and pepper hair, messily strewn across his scalp. He approaches me and asks me which way the highway is, and I just pointed back down the street. I am not even sure that was the right direction, but I sure as heck wanted to be helpful to a stranger. I remember he smiled and thanked me, and it was only then that I started to get nervous. It was his teeth. They were all discolored and crooked. I think most kids associate monsters with their teeth. Maybe most adults do too. I know I certainly do, and seeing that guy's teeth put the fear of God into me. But I tried to stay polite when he asked me how my Christmas went, showing him my new skates when he asked me what Santa had brought me that year. It was then that he told me that Santa had been extra generous to him and his family that year and had brought his daughter so many presents that she didn't even want all of them. Now my family has always been close-knit, loving and generous with their money. They just never had a lot of it. So holidays for us were always pretty sparse affairs, which is why when the Scarecrow Man told me his daughter got so much that she didn't even want some of her presents, I couldn't quite believe my ears. And when he actually offered me a Barbie-themed dollhouse, one I actually really did want, I almost forgot about how nervous I was of him. It wasn't enough to completely shake the fear out of me though. So when he told me he had it in the back of the van asking me if I'd like to come take a look, I just started skating away from him, shaking my head silently. But instead of just shrugging it off and getting back into his van, he starts to follow me back towards my parents' place, asking if it was where I lived, if my parents were home, that kind of stuff. We hadn't had any stranger danger lessons in school, so it was only out of pure instinct that I unlatched the gate to my parents' place and began to wail for my Nana. No sooner had I let out the second cry than my Nana appears with this big old cast iron pan in her hand and comes tearing up the path towards me and what I know now to be my potential abductor. And she's screaming bloody murder as she does so. I didn't see this at the time, but from what my mom told me years later at my Nana's funeral, this guy takes one look at Nana, fills his riches, and just bugs the heck out of there as she chases his van up the street. I do remember seeing her swinging that pan around and telling him to come back so she could beat him black and blue. And as much as her display of furiousness freaked me out, I was just grateful she could be twice as scary as Scarecrow Man had been. The way my mom tells it, Nana had tried to get the van's tag number only to find it didn't have one. The guy was a predator through and through and had obviously been prepping and gearing up to kidnap someone for whatever reason that may be. Next thing I know, the cops are at our house. My dad has come home early from work and I am having to tell people over and over again what the guy looked like while they write things down and ask me a zillion questions about the color of the van, the guy's clothes, like every little detail you could possibly think of. Needless to say, I didn't get to go out on my skates again for the rest of the holidays. So like I mentioned, this whole story came up at my Nana's funeral when we were telling tales about her. And the one really freaky thing about the whole incident, and something I didn't know until years after, was that when me and Nana described the Scarecrow Man to the cops, they both shot each other a look like holy crap before telling Nana and my dad that we had pretty much just described another one of their perps to them to a T. We had described a guy that had made several other attempts at kidnapping kids in broad daylight over the holiday period. A guy they were desperate to get their hands on because they knew it was just a matter of time before his luck turned and he managed to trick a kid into getting into the van. Knowing I could well have been dead before my 10th birthday, having endured unimaginable torment before I was finally put out of my misery, is something that makes my skin crawl even to this day. I live in a place called Beddington, Maine, which happens to be the least populated part of the state and probably one of the least populated areas in the country. With a population just over 50, we're the epitome of a one-stoplight town. We all live fairly spread out, too. My nearest neighbor on the right side is about a mile away, and the one on the left is about 3 miles out. The sense of community here is strong, but you're really alone in most ways, especially when there's a power outage. Power cuts are rare here, but they've happened a couple of times since I've been living here. One time, it was only out for about an hour, but the second time was a whole different story. Something must have gone seriously wrong at the power station because the power was out all night. I don't just remember that night because I missed the Pats game. It stuck in my memory for other reasons too. Like I said, it was only the second power cut I'd experienced. But thanks to my first experience, I was better prepared. I had candles, dynamo flashlights, and even a battery-powered hot plate that would last a while, even if it did burn through batteries fast. So instead of panicking and stumbling around in the dark, I just made myself comfortable, picked up a book, and settled down on the couch to wait it out. Now, I should mention my dog, Teddy. He got his name because my grown-up daughter said he looked like a teddy bear, which he really does. And because of his superior senses, power cuts never bothered him. Teddy never bumped into furniture or got spooked by every little noise or shadow. He'd just curl up by the log fire and keep warm. As I settled in, Teddy gave me this look, like he was saying, "See, now you get it, old man. Just relax and take a load off." The power would come back when it was ready, no big deal. But Teddy didn't stay calm for long, and neither did I. A couple of hours passed, and I was so absorbed in my book that when Teddy suddenly started barking, it nearly scared the life out of me. Teddy never barked at anything. Even when he saw squirrels or raccoons, he'd just give me this look, like, "What are you going to do about those 3 critters, old man?" Nothing fazed him, ever. So hearing him bark like that was already unusual. That made me wonder what could possibly have him freaked out enough to bark. I asked, "What is it, boy? What are you smelling?" But instead of answering me, Teddy got up and walked over to the door leading to the hallway. He started growling low and steady between barks. As I watched him, I felt this terrible sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. It was the first time I'd ever seen him act like that, aggressive and territorial. Now, as much as I respect the Second Amendment, I don't believe in keeping guns in the house. I've never liked them. When I was a kid, I lost a relative in a tragic accident, and just being around weapons makes me uneasy. But for home defense, I do have an old recurve bow that I use for hunting. Not the most practical choice against an intruder, but it's better than nothing. I must have looked like an old worn-out Comanche warrior creeping through my living room with a bow and arrow with only firelight to see where I was going. But I sure didn't feel like one. I just turned 55. I was a grown man, but something about all that darkness and being so isolated made me feel like a scared kid. Best case scenario, Teddy had picked up the smell of a bear or a lynx on the wind, one that was still way off in the distance. Worst case would be something considerably worse. When I take a peek out front of the house through the window of my office, Teddy follows, jumping up on the windowsill and barking a few times after sniffing the air. Whatever he was smelling, I sure wasn't seeing it. So after peering into the darkness for a minute or two, I just take Teddy back into the TV room where he stopped his barking. All was quiet again, so I carried on with my reading. About an hour later, the same thing happens all over again. Teddy jumps up from the rug, barking up a storm. Only this time, he seems considerably more aggressive. He bounds over to the door of the TV room, scratching at the handle and growling in a way that actually kind of frightened me. Like I said before, I had never seen Teddy act like that, and he was a completely different dog. When I let him out of the TV room, Teddy ran through the open door of the kitchen and started barking and scratching at the back door. I mean, he was going back there, and there was no way I was going to let him outside. The mood he was in, he would probably run off as fast as he could and getting himself lost. And besides that, I felt strangely safer with Teddy around. He stopped barking for a second, sniffed the air, and then bolted back into the TV room where he started barking even louder at the glass patio doors that led to the backyard. I follow him. I'm all like, "Get him, boy. Tear him up." But when I catch a glimpse of the sliding glass doors, I'd swear I saw something moving in the shadows outside. I couldn't even tell you what I saw. It was nothing more than a flash of movement, but it was obvious enough for me to grab that recurve bow that I had propped up against the couch. I was so scared that I could barely line the arrow up with the drawstring. Teddy was going crazy at this point, acting like he was fixing to smash through the glass windows and chase down whatever he could smell. And like I said, it might have even just been the way the firelight reflected on the glass, but I wasn't willing to roll the dice on something being out there. Then suddenly, Teddy stops barking again. I figure it's because he lost the scent or something, because he shuts up entirely and stops pawing at the glass in the back door. But then he went and did the weirdest thing. He backs off from the doors, stands in front of me, shaking on all fours, and takes a piss right there on the carpet. He hadn't done anything like that since he was a puppy. Teddy was hardcore house trained. It's definitely not out of fear of some black bear either. Teddy's been in the same area as those ever since he was a puppy. And unless he actually saw one, I can't imagine he would freak out the way that he did. But the fact remains that animals like dogs have been known to just go to the bathroom on themselves whenever a much larger predator is in the area. Only I can't imagine how much larger it must have been to make Teddy forget his house training. After that, he was almost completely silent. Just the occasional whimper while I stood there in the firelight, just waiting for the mother of all black bears to come smashing through the back windows. At least, I hoped it was nothing but a black bear. I understand those animals, but I didn't understand what was going on during that power out at all, and it just about scared the crap out of me. But by far, the worst part of the experience was when I actually heard something on the little sidewalk way to my house. See, there's a little gravel path where my wife used to grow vegetables right around the side of my house. And I swear to the Almighty that I heard two distinct crunches on the gravel right as I'm staring out into the darkness for like the 100th time. That's when I started to call out. I know you're there. I'm armed. Now you better get out of here. I listened again, and for the next few minutes, there was nothing but silence. Just then, when I started to think I had imagined the whole thing, I heard it again, clear as day, footfalls on the gravel. That time I was closer, and I had heard people walk up and down the gravel path 100 times over the years. So I'm telling you right now, whatever was outside my house that night was way, way bigger than a person. If it was a black bear, it must have been the biggest one on the entire East Coast. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't a bear or something. Maybe it was just a big old dog that got lost and took to wandering into my yard. But like I said, it was big, really big. And you can bet I was shaking like a dog as I heard its footfalls getting quieter and quieter as it made its way off my property. I didn't hear anything for the rest of the night. Teddy didn't bark again, but he seemed like he had thrown in the towel with that line of defense anyway. But I didn't hear anything outside, and evidently, nothing broke into the house. Otherwise, I'd be rambling on about it. It's just kind of surreal to me that one of the scariest experiences of my life comes across like a second-rate campfire tale. I don't scare easy, and what happened during that blackout scared me to death. I just hope whatever the thing was, whether it was a bear or the Turner beast or something else entirely, stays well away from my property in the future. Because it would take far more than just a few arrows to take down a beast as big as that. In February 1978, 23-year-old Stephen Kabatsky was attending Hope College, a small Christian institution situated in Holland, Michigan, on the southeastern shore of Lake Michigan. A dedicated yet unconventional history major, Stephen had once co-written an opinion piece for the campus newspaper, criticizing the university's inadequate book collection in the library. In it, he also suggested that the school install an electronic security system to prevent theft. Bob Nammer, who graduated from Hope in the spring of 1978, didn't know Stephen personally but was familiar with his reputation. Fellow students often spoke of Stephen as though he were some kind of brilliant, free-spirited thinker. Despite living a relatively conservative life, his off-campus residence gave him the aura of an independent intellectual. He was definitely a big Dungeons and Dragons guy, Nammer remarked, but he owned it. It was cool. He wasn't your typical nerd, that's for sure. Stephen was also recognized for his passion for the outdoors, having previously climbed mountains while studying abroad in Europe. He'd gone cross-country skiing in the area surrounding Lake Michigan before, so nothing about his planned skiing trip in February of 1978 seemed out of the ordinary. However, this trip would become a turning point in his life. Stephen intended to spend the weekend skiing alone and planned to return by Monday at the latest. Initially, when Monday passed without any word from him, his absence raised only mild concern. But when Stephen, who was known for his punctuality and commitment, failed to show up for a second consecutive day, it quickly became clear that something was terribly wrong. The details of how he was first reported missing vary depending on who recounts the story, but according to a local news report from February 21, 1978, Snowmobilers in Saugatuck discovered a pair of cross-country skis and a backpack abandoned in the snow. They immediately notified the authorities, who began a search by air and land. A missing persons report was filed with the local police, and they were able to focus their efforts on the area where Stephen had been last seen. It was there they found a trail of footprints in the snow, stretching for about 200 yards, the same size and track as the ski boots that Steve would have been wearing. But eerily, the same footprints led past the edge of Lake Michigan, ending abruptly in a way which led search and rescue personnel to conclude that Steve had somehow drowned under a thick layer of unbroken ice. Although it could never be fully proven, the official conclusion was that Steve was dead, and would only be a matter of time before the currents of Lake Michigan deposited his decomposing corpse somewhere on the shores of Lake Michigan. Steve's family was devastated and resigned themselves to waiting a long time for any answers to the many questions surrounding his disappearance. But they had no idea just how close or how shocking those answers would be. Steve Kabotsky had no idea he was even missing when he opened his eyes one Saturday night and found himself lying on a patch of grass in a place he wasn't familiar with. As he came to his senses, he realized he didn't recognize the clothes he was wearing nor the backpack he was in possession of. Neither his original backpack nor his skis were anywhere to be seen, and somehow he didn't remember where or how he'd lost them. Feeling extremely disoriented, Steve got up, approached a passing stranger, and asked them where they were. Pittsfield, the stranger replied in confusion. Pittsfield? Stephen replied, initially believing himself to be in the Ann Arbor suburb of the same name. How did they get all the way over to Ann Arbor? Ann Arbor? The stranger sounded even more confused now. Buddy, this isn't Michigan. This is Pittsfield, Massachusetts. See? The stranger then pointed to a nearby parked car, one clearly showing a Massachusetts license plate. Stephen was dumbfounded. He'd only intended to ski around the countryside outside of Holland, Michigan. Instead, not only had he somehow ended up more than 700 miles east of his proposed route, but he had absolutely no recollection of how he'd gotten there. The situation was a horrifying one in its own. But when David passed a nearby newsstand and set eyes on the newspaper, he almost passed out in shock. In the top corner of the page, the date read May 5th, 79. But that was impossible because it meant that Stephen had just spent the past 15 months in some kind of waking coma, one in which he had somehow made an almost 1,000-mile journey across the country. In a state of complete shock, Stephen managed to recall that he had an aunt in a place called Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which turned out to only be around 20 miles from Pittsfield itself. Since he had no money, he managed to hitchhike out to his aunt's place, who says she received the shock of her life when they saw him at the door. It was like seeing a ghost, she later said. Steve's emotional reunion with the family who'd long thought him dead became a national media sensation. At a hastily called press conference, Steve told a gathering of reporters that when he woke up in Pittsfield, he was wearing a different set of clothes from those he'd set out in the previous year. He also had a new backpack filled with maps and hitchhiking signs that suggested that he had traveled extensively during his year-long unconscious episode. He was somehow in possession of memorabilia from Sacramento, San Francisco, Reno, Chicago, and Utah. He also had $40 in cash, new glasses, sneakers, and a t-shirt from a marathon that had taken place in Wisconsin. I feel I've done a lot of running, he said in an interview the week he reappeared. His memory right up until his disappearance remained intact. He said the last thing he remembered was feeling cold and scared of being lost in the frozen darkness. Steve told a reporter that he believed his blackout was caused by exhaustion and exposure, and said he would see a medical doctor for a physical, but despite his parents' insistence, would not be seeing any kind of therapist or psychiatrist. My father was going to sign over the house to me. I had 3 courses at school and no trouble, he said. There was no trouble with girls. I had a job lined up with a Holland Sentinel newspaper. I was in a good place mentally, so I don't think that side of things has anything to do with it. Obviously, Steve didn't end up taking the job at the Sentinel, and his bachelor's degree was awarded absentia from Hope College when he was thought to have passed away. Although drowning was the most commonly accepted theory, some of the detectives who investigated his disappearance had their doubts that Stephen was actually dead. At one point, Detectives were so flummoxed that they sent Stephen's dental records to Chicago to see if Kabaki might be among the serial killer John Wayne Gacy's unidentified victims. These days, Stephen is alive and well, and is working as a psychologist in the Pacific Northwest. For decades, he had refused to speak about his disappearance with reporters, and any attempts to reach out to him are generally ignored right off the bat. Reporters have even reached out to his ex-wife, assuming that she might be able to shed some light on the mystery, but she too flat out refuses to reveal what she knows. Stephen's case is perhaps one of the most fascinating cases of a missing person showing up alive, and for a number of reasons, but the lack of contemporary media coverage of the event is frankly baffling. Only in small shady corners of paranormal-obsessed message boards has Stephen's case been anything close to fully explored. There, the most commonly accepted explanation ties into the fact that the site of Steve's disappearance was close to the southeastern boundary, the Lake Michigan Triangle, an area spanning from Manitowoc, Wisconsin to Ludington, Michigan, and south to Benton Harbor, where several other mysterious disappearances are said to have taken place. But it's not just people that have fallen victim to the Bermuda Triangle's lesser-known cousin, as the area has seen numerous unexplained air disasters, shipwrecks, and vanishings that date back centuries. There are stories of ghost ships, ghost planes, heavily corroborated UFO sightings, and one particularly hair-raising tale about a competitive sailing crew that passed through what sounds like a vortex during a practice run on a calm, early summer evening. After a sudden dramatic fall of fog and wind filling the mainsail from two opposing directions, 3 wooden ships took on a life of their own and performed synchronized 360-degree turns with no one steering. But as much as some of these stories sound like something out of a cheap dime novel, and it might well be, Stephen's disappearance was well documented and is in no way an elaborate hoax. It's possible that Stephen sustained some sort of head injury that could account for his memory loss. However, if that were the case, then why did a later medical examination show that he was in perfect health? A few years after the incident, Stephen spoke to the media, explaining that he had tried retracing the steps he took on his solo skiing trip, hoping it might offer some clues to help him recall where he had been and what had happened during that time when his memory was blank. But despite revisiting the site of his disappearance, Stephen seemed unable to uncover any new information. And if he did come across anything, he never shared it with the press. This leaves us with lingering questions. Has Stephen remained silent about his disappearance because the events are still a mystery to him? Or has he recalled something so horrifying that he cannot bring himself to speak about it? The absolute silence from his friends and family only deepens the mystery. In the end, it seems that the strange case of Stephen Kabatsky's disappearance will likely remain an unsolved enigma. I'm a pretty small girl, though I like to pretend my 5-foot frame isn't scared of anything. I've got facial piercings, brightly colored hair, and a bold attitude to match. I started working at a gas station in one of the quieter areas of my city when I was 19, and I absolutely loved it. I had a good group of regular customers, and the occasional creepy late-night visitor, but nothing I couldn't handle. After a while, I also started working at an ice cream shop and a barber shop, both owned by the same family in the same plaza. Pretty cool, right? One summer day, the barber drove over to the gas station, and as he pulled in, he accidentally drove over one of the gas tank covers, which caused the pipe to leak down into the tank. Since the gasoline is stored in massive underground tanks, any break in the pipes leading to them could be dangerous for several reasons: sparks, rainwater, and the like. Knowing how risky this was, I walked outside to check it out with him. As I walked out, I noticed he was staring at me oddly. He said, "You look good today," and I shrugged it off as a compliment. I nodded and gave a quick thanks, trying to keep things casual, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling from the way he was looking at me. Still, I didn't overthink it because there were people around. I hurriedly kicked the cover back into place and went back inside, knowing there were customers waiting for service. He came back in a few minutes later with a bowl of ice cream from his other shop and placed it on the counter. "Sorry for pulling you away from work," he said. "I was just worried about someone getting hurt." I smiled and thanked him, moving the bowl over to the side. I reached for my wallet, but before I could, he quickly stopped me, saying, "All I need is a kiss." I laughed, thinking he was just joking around like some of my older customers do, and replied, "No kisses, but if I could, I'd give you a hug." I assumed he was just being friendly, and he knew the rules of my workplace. Plus, I didn't think he was the type to be creepy. After that, he pointed out some chocolate bars and empty boxes outside the counter that needed rearranging. My workplace was always picky about the displays, so without thinking, I went over to fix them. That's when I felt his hand brush against my behind. I immediately stood up and stomped my foot on his, saying, "I think it's time for you to leave and go back to your own place." I rushed back behind the counter, and he apologized, saying he was just adjusting his apron and would never do anything like that. At first, I thought maybe I overreacted, but then I realized something. It was impossible for a vehicle to flip the tank cover. Those covers are made to be driven over, like the ones covering sewage drains, and would require serious force to move. It dawned on me that the barber had kicked it in deliberately to get my attention. I repeated my request for him to leave, but then he grabbed my arm and said, in a very menacing tone, that I'd have an affair with him. He smiled and walked out. As soon as he was gone, I threw the ice cream away without touching it and tried to get back to work, forcing myself to stay calm. The next couple of days went by without incident, but the third night he started to drive by after I'd closed and locked up for the night. As I was counting my cash, he would blow me kisses and wave weirdly or sign that he was offering me a ride home. I always pretended not to see him, but I began to call people on my phone every time I had the closing shift. It escalated when I thought I saw his vehicle parked out back by the garbage bins, light off and in the dark with someone sitting on the driver's side. I called the police and explained what had been happening, telling them I was afraid for my safety. They came quickly and found out it was just some kid smoking dope in a vehicle that just happened to be the same make and model as his. But I felt better knowing that they had been made aware. After the police report was filed, he didn't bother me for a couple of weeks. Thinking it had stopped for good, my boyfriend took me over for an ice cream date after checking to make sure he wasn't in for the day. The next night, I was with my friends about 5 minutes before closing. He stormed in practically threw a bowl of ice cream at me, spitting, "Have a great night," and angrily rushed out. I was very confused and scared, wondering if he knew we'd gone to the shop. The next day he walked by the pumps and looked around at each camera, and then back at me with a smile and a wave. I saw on the other cameras that he was looking at the ones around the building as well. I called my dad and he picked me up that night. After that, I decided I'd had enough for the day and I went into his barbershop with an RCMP officer I knew very well. I told him he was no longer welcome on the gas station premises and that if he came back when I was inside, the police would be notified. He started off by acting confused and a little hurt and that I was making such awful accusations, but ended by yelling at me and telling me that he would find me and hurt me because I was a slut and would get what I deserved. I was scared because besides the one small joke I made it clear to him that he was not welcome anywhere near me. I quit my job shortly after that and haven't hung around the place besides the time I need to stop in and get gas in a rush. A few weeks before I quit my job though, whilst the creep was hanging out, another man walked in. Noticing I was uncomfortable, he waited for the creep to leave before asking me if I was okay. I smiled and said, "Yeah, of course. What can I get for you?" He told me he could start by telling him the truth. He slid me a business card across the counter and I looked down and I saw that it was a police information card. I looked up at him and he smiled and he said, "Give me a call to my extension this evening when you finish work. I work around here, so if anything is wrong, I would feel better being informed so I can keep an eye out." I thanked him profusely and he went on his way. Late that night I called and filled him in, but asked him not to file a report because the police had already been notified prior to my phone call to him. The next day he came over to my house to take another statement and give me information for what I should do, like press charges or try for a restraining order, as well as give me case numbers and other pertinent information about the creep. He met my dad, and they talked about being a police officer for a while, and then we all sat down to discuss the situation. My laptop background was a slightly sexy Halloween photo of my boyfriend and I, where I had my leg up a fake gun and was dressed up as a sexy Eagle Scout. I completely forgot what my background was since my laptop had sat unused for a couple of weeks, and he made a lewd comment about not wanting to see any of my homemade videos that my boyfriend and I had made. It made me feel quite uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. I quickly opened a Word document and wrote down what he told me whilst Googling the barber and giving him information on what I was finding. It turned out the barber had been involved in a lot of trouble, fraud, theft, and a few other things. After a few weeks, I finally told him to stop coming into the store, which led to a huge argument at his barbershop. So I decided to just let it go. It wasn't worth the anxiety it was causing me, but I kept in touch with a police officer who would drop by my work or occasionally text me to check in and see if everything was okay. I appreciated his concern. It made me feel like I could rely on him if I ever needed help. A few months later, he texted me asking how I'd been since leaving the gas station and how school was going. He mentioned it had been so long he didn't remember what I looked like. I responded, "I'm still an angry punk rock metal lady." He replied, "Ah, send me a photo." I felt really uncomfortable and didn't respond. Instead, I deleted the conversation and went on with my daily life. I didn't hear from him for a while, about from November until just before New Year's. It was the day before New Year's Eve when I was on my way to a doctor's appointment to confirm some pretty upsetting news that he texted me, asking what I was doing for New Year's Eve. I didn't respond right away, but a few days after New Year's, I told him everything had gone fine. He then asked if I'd gotten lucky. I told him that was inappropriate and unacceptable, to which he replied, "You know, you'd be a lot less grouchy if you got laid regularly." The way he said it, along with a winky face, made it clear he was implying that I should come to him for that. I was furious and terrified. He knew where I lived, worked, and went to school. I immediately deleted the conversation and blocked his number. That night, I called my boyfriend and cried about it. He got really upset with me, giving me a hard time for not being smarter and keeping the messages. I even tried contacting Apple in California to see if they could retrieve the texts since they're stored internally, but of course they refused due to privacy issues. Still, I gave it a shot. In July, I ran into him again after a horrible night at the bar. I was walking down the street with a friend when I saw him at the end of his driveway. He asked why I hadn't been texting him anymore, and I came up with an excuse before quickly walking away. Once we were in a safe spot, my friend looked at me and said, "You don't even have to tell me. I can tell by the look he gave you. Promise me you won't walk down that street alone again." It's not surprising that, after all of this, I'm having serious trust issues with new people. The first thing I noticed about Millhaven was the silence. No birds chirping, no distant hum of traffic, not even the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. I had stumbled upon the town by accident, my GPS failing miles back on a hike that had gone terribly wrong. As I hobbled down the empty main street, my sprained ankle aching, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wandered into a place I wasn't meant to be. I had started the morning full of energy, excited to try a new trail I had found online. The website promised breathtaking views and a moderate level of difficulty, perfect for a solo day hike. But 3 hours in, I realized I had seriously underestimated the terrain. The trail became more and more difficult, and my water ran out faster than I expected. Then came the fall, one wrong step on a loose rock, and I was tumbling down a steep incline, my ankle twisting painfully beneath me. By the time I managed to stop, I was disoriented, in pain, and utterly lost. My phone had no signal and my GPS refused to load. With the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, I knew I needed to find help fast. That's when I saw the faint outline of rooftops in the distance. A glimmer of hope surged through me as I limped toward what I prayed was civilization. But as I got closer, that hope turned into something darker. Millhaven looked as though it had been frozen in time. The storefronts along Main Street could have been lifted straight from the 1950s. Their paint was faded, but they still looked eerily untouched. Cars were parked at odd angles, as if their drivers had simply vanished mid-journey. And everywhere, that strange, unsettling silence. "Hello!" I called out, my voice seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is anyone here? I need help." No response, not even an echo. It was as if the very air swallowed my words. I limped toward what looked like a diner, its neon open sign flickering weakly in the dying light. The bell above the door emitted a soft, muffled ding as I stepped inside and found myself in a perfectly preserved piece of mid-century Americana. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and an old jukebox stood silent in the corner. But there wasn't a soul in sight. "Hello," I called again, quieter this time, as if afraid to break the eerie calm. "Please, I'm hurt. I need to call for help." As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I saw something strange. On one of the tables, a half-eaten meal sat cooling on a plate, the coffee in the mug beside it still steaming. It was as though the diner's patrons had vanished mid-bite. A cold chill ran down my spine. Something was very, very wrong here. I backed out of the diner, my heart racing. The street looked different now, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. And then I saw it. Movement in one of the shop windows across the street. A face, pale and gaunt, peering out at me before quickly disappearing behind a curtain. "Wait," I called out, stumbling towards the shop. "Please, I need help." As I reached for the door handle, it swung open, and I found myself face to face with an elderly woman. Her eyes were sunken, her skin papery thin, but there was a sharpness to her gaze that made me take a step back. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe after dark." Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me inside, slamming the door behind us. The shop appeared to be some kind of general store, shelves stocked with dusty canned goods and outdated household items. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Where is everyone? I just need to call for help." "My ankle." "Shoo," she hissed, pressing a bony finger to her lips. "They'll hear you." "Who?" I whispered back, fear coiling in my gut. The old woman peered out the window, her eyes darting back and forth. "The others," she said cryptically, "the ones who took everyone else. We thought they were a blessing at first, you know. They came with promises of a better life, of immortality. And oh, how we believed them." I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. "I don't understand. What others? What happened to this town?" She turned back to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "They came 5 years ago. Strangers offering a miracle drug. Said it would stop aging, cure all illnesses. And it worked for a while. But then," her voice trailed off, and she shuddered. "People started to change, not just stopping aging but reverting, getting younger. Too young until they just disappeared. Babies one day, gone the next. And those of us who didn't take it, well, were the only ones left. Hiding, waiting." I felt dizzy, her words painting a picture too horrific to fully comprehend. "But that's impossible," I stammered. "Things like that don't happen in real life." The old woman let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea what's possible, but you need to leave now before they find you." As if on cue, a low humming sound filled the air. The old woman's eyes widened in terror. "They're coming," she whispered. "You need to hide." She shoved me towards a back room, but I resisted. "Wait, I can't just leave you here. Come with me. We can both escape." But she shook her head firmly. "I'm too old, too slow. I'll only slow you down. Go now. And whatever you do, don't let them catch you. Don't let them offer you anything. Just run." The humming grew louder, and I could see a strange, pulsing light through the shop windows. Against my better judgment, I did as the old woman instructed, limping as quickly as I could toward the back of the store. I found a small storage room and squeezed inside, pulling the door closed behind me. Through a crack in the door, I saw the shop fill with an eerie blue light. I could hear voices, but they didn't sound human. They were more like a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't comprehend. I held my breath, pressing myself against the back wall of the storage room. The voices grew louder, and I saw shadows shifting just outside my hiding place. My heart pounded so hard, I was certain they could hear it. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. The light dimmed, and the humming ceased. I waited, barely daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. Finally, when I couldn't stand the tension any longer, I cautiously opened the door and peeked out. The shop was empty. No sign of the old woman or the strange beings she had warned me about. I crept out, my ankle protesting with every step, and made my way back toward the front of the store. Outside, Millhaven looked the same as it had before, silent, empty, frozen in time. But now, I knew the terrifying truth that lay beneath its surface. I didn't linger to see if the beings would return. Ignoring the pain in my ankle, I ran. I ran until the town was a distant memory, until I found a road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver looked at me like I had lost my mind when I told him about Millhaven, but he was kind enough to take me to the nearest hospital. I never reported what happened in that town. Who would believe me? Sometimes I question whether I really experienced it at all. But on quiet nights, when everything feels too still, I remember the old woman's warning. And I wonder about the people of Millhaven, about the terrible price they paid for the promise of eternal youth. And I know with a chilling certainty that there are some places in this world that are best left undiscovered. Some communities that, once you enter, you might never leave again. The golden light of sunset bathed the forest in warm, inviting colors, but a cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. As I peered through the lens of my camera, I caught sight of something that shouldn't have been there. A pair of gleaming eyes, staring back at me from the shadows. In that moment, I understood. I was no longer the observer. I had become the prey, and the hunter was something I could never have imagined. My name's Jack, and I'm a wildlife photographer. Over the years, I've tracked and photographed some of the world's most elusive creatures. From snow leopards in the Himalayas to jaguars in the Amazon, I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing prepared me for what I was about to encounter in the isolated wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I had come to this stretch of ancient forest after hearing rumors of an undocumented species. Local tribes spoke of a creature that walked on two legs, was covered in fur, and had eyes that glowed in the dark. Most people dismissed it as mere folklore, but I've learned that legends often hold a kernel of truth. For days, I had been setting up camera traps and monitoring promising locations. All I had seen so far were the usual animals: deer, elk, the occasional black bear. But as the sun began to set on my 5th day in the forest, everything changed. I was in a tree blind, camera in hand, watching a small clearing where I had earlier noticed strange tracks. The light was quickly fading, and I was about to pack up for the night when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My heart raced, but years of experience kept me rooted in place. I raised my camera and peered through the telephoto lens, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. 2 eyes, reflecting the last slivers of sunlight, set in a face that was almost human but not quite. I snapped a rapid series of photos, my camera's shutter sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet of the forest. The moment I lowered the camera, the eyes vanished, but I could still feel its presence, watching, waiting. My hands shook as I reviewed the photos I'd just taken. Most were blurry, useless, but just one was crystal clear. What I saw made my blood run cold. The face was ape-like, but the intelligence in its eyes was unmistakable. This was no known animal. This was something else entirely. As darkness fell, I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever this creature was, it was clearly aware of me, and I didn't want to find out if it was as curious about me as I was about it. I began to pack up my gear as quietly as possible, all too aware of the rustling sounds coming from the underbrush around me. Just as I was about to descend from my perch, a blood-curdling screech pierced the night. It was close, too close. I froze, one hand on the tree trunk, the other clutching my camera bag. The forest had gone deathly quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the forest, heading straight for my tree. Panic surged through me. I dealt with charging elephants and stalking tigers, but always from a safe distance or with guides nearby. Here I was alone, and whatever was coming was unlike anything in my experience. I scrambled down the tree, no longer caring about stealth. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I ran. I had no plan, no direction in mind. Pure instinct drove me forward, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing. The creature moved with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. It was toying with me, I realized with growing horror. Could have caught me at any time, but it was drawing out the chase. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. In the darkness, I could barely see where I was going. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I plunged forward, tumbling down a steep embankment. Pain shot through my body as I rolled, unable to stop my descent. When I finally came to a stop, I lay there for a moment, dazed and winded. The sound of rushing water filled my ears. I had landed near a river. As I struggled to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ankle, an idea struck me. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to rely heavily on scent. If I could cross the river, I might be able to throw it off my trail. I limped towards the sound of water, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The river loomed before me, a black ribbon cutting through the forest. It was wide and fast-moving, far more dangerous than I had hoped, but I could hear movement in the forest behind me. I was out of options. Taking a deep breath, I waded in. The icy water took my breath away, but I pushed forward. The current tugged at my legs, threatening to sweep me away. By the time I reached the middle, the water was up to my chest. My camera bag felt like it weighed a ton, dragging me down. Just as I thought I wouldn't make it, my feet found purchase on the other side. I dragged myself onto the bank, soaked and shivering, but I couldn't rest yet. I had to put more distance between myself and whatever was chasing me. I stumbled through the forest, my wet clothes clinging to me, my teeth chattering. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential pursuer. But gradually, I realized I couldn't hear anything following me anymore. As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion set in. I needed to find shelter, to rest, and try to figure out where I was. In the dim pre-dawn light, I spotted a large hollow log. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I crawled inside, curling up as best I could. As I lay there, shivering and aching, I thought about the photos in my camera. If I had managed to capture what I thought I had, it would change everything. But at what cost? Was any discovery worth this terror? I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the log. For a moment, I was disoriented. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back. Cautiously, I peeked out of my hiding place. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more familiar. But I knew appearances could be deceiving. Whatever had chased me last night could still be out there. I checked my GPS unit, relieved to find it had survived the river crossing. I was about 5 miles from my campsite. It would be a tough hike with my injured ankle, but I had no choice. I needed to get back to civilization, to show someone the photos I had taken. The journey back was a blur of pain and paranoia. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every rustling leaf had me looking over my shoulder. But nothing appeared. No glowing eyes. No inhuman shrieks. Just the normal sounds of a forest going about its day. When I finally stumbled into my campsite, I almost wept with relief. My tent was still there, untouched. I quickly packed up, my hands shaking with exhaustion and lingering fear. I needed to get out of those woods, back to my car, back to safety. The hike to the trailhead felt like the longest 2 miles of my life. When I finally spotted my battered Land Rover, I nearly wept in relief. I tossed my gear into the back and took off without a second thought, not caring about the dust cloud I was kicking up. It wasn't until I was miles away, the forest now a faint green blur in my rearview mirror, that I allowed myself to breathe. I had made it. I had survived. But as the terror began to fade, a strange excitement took its place. I had witnessed something extraordinary, something that could challenge everything we knew about the natural world. And I had the proof. Once I had cell service, I called my editor. "Mark," I said, my voice raspy from exhaustion and adrenaline. "You're not going to believe what I've got." The photos caused an uproar, of course. Scientists, cryptozoologists, and thrill seekers all flocked to the forest. But despite thorough searches, no one ever found definitive proof of the creature I had encountered. Even now, sometimes in the dead of night, I wake up in a cold sweat, the eerie echo of that otherworldly shriek still ringing in my ears. I've never returned to those woods, and I never will. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. But I'll never forget the night I became the prey, hunted by something that shouldn't exist. It changed me, reminded me that in the grand scheme of things, humans are not always the apex predator. Somewhere out there, deep in the forest, something is watching, waiting, reminding us that there are still wild places in this world where we are not in control. This happened about a year ago, and I still can't believe I made it out of that situation unscathed, at least physically. The night started off with me being at my friend's apartment in a pretty rough part of town, making a series of terrible decisions. I decided to get belligerently drunk and take a few unknown pills. I know, looking back, I realize how dumb that was. By 4 a.m., after a full night of partying, I was definitely not in the right state of mind. But my drug-fueled brain decided that, instead of staying the night at my friend's place like I normally would, I wanted to Uber back to my apartment instead. My friend's apartment had 2 separate entrances, one in the back parking lot, which was dark and unlit, and one facing the street. They had 2 sets of keys, but I only had the one for the back door. Since my Uber would be arriving at the street and the front door locks itself behind you, I decided to leave that way. Looking back, I realized I must have looked like the easiest target on the planet. I'm a small, petite female in my early 20s, barely able to stay upright. I was using a street lamp to prop myself up, but it wasn't doing a very good job. The light felt like a beacon to anyone nearby saying, "Come and get me." I wasn't paying attention to my surroundings at all, even though there was literally a bullet hole in the front door I just came out of. Not exactly a great sign. I do remember checking which car I was getting picked up in and saw that it was a black sedan. Not much else registered in my foggy state. Soon after, a black sedan pulled up to the curb and the window started to roll down. I stepped forward, still a bit out of it. But before he even spoke, I felt that something was off. His expression alone made me feel like he was tearing me apart with just his eyes. That look, it made me realize what it's like to feel like prey. He barked at me, "I'm your Uber driver." That was the second red flag. Usually, Uber drivers introduce themselves by saying your name. I just stared at him for a second, my brain slowly processing what was happening. Finally, I asked, "What's my name?" His response was immediate rage. He started screaming about how he didn't have time for this, telling me to just get in the car. At that moment, I snapped out of it and sobered up faster than I ever had in my life. I was completely panicking, realizing that this wasn't my Uber. I quickly checked the license plate, and it was obviously a mismatch. Meanwhile, this guy was still screaming at me, and I had no idea what to do. If I ran, I had no way of knowing if he had a weapon or if he could outrun me. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't think clearly. It felt like everything was happening in slow motion, but at the same time, I knew I needed to act fast. At this point, I was sure that if this guy was trying to grab a random girl off the street, he must have some kind of weapon. I couldn't run back into the apartment because the door locks behind you, and I didn't have the keys and certainly didn't have the time to unlock it. Running toward the back door wouldn't help either, since he was idling right by the mouth of the driveway toward the back parking lot. If I ran, I'd still need the right keys, and even if I found them, it wouldn't guarantee I could get inside. I could scream, but I knew I wasn't in the kind of neighborhood where someone would try to play the hero. I could still hear the music coming from my friend's third-floor apartment, but I knew they wouldn't hear me. It was 4 a.m., and absolutely no one was around. People talk about these situations where you either freeze or sprint into action, but in that moment, I felt completely incapable of doing either. It was the worst feeling I've ever had. Everything inside me screamed to run, but I knew deep down that running would likely be the end of me. If I stayed there, frozen in shock, staring at this man as he screamed at me, the outcome would probably be the same. From the moment he started yelling at me until now, I'd guess only about 20 seconds had passed. Just as he looked like he was getting ready to step out of the car, another black sedan pulled up right behind him. I quickly checked the license plate, and to my absolute relief, it was my actual Uber. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the car, only about 6 steps, and threw myself into the back seat. I screamed at my real Uber driver, "What's my name?" The poor guy looked terrified but quickly responded with my name. I immediately shouted, "Get me out of here. This man is trying to kidnap me." If I were in my Uber driver's position, I think I would have been too shocked to react that quickly. But this guy was amazing. He immediately sped off, offered to call the police, which I regret declining now, and then walked me to the front door of my apartment, making sure I got inside safely. He was truly an incredible human being. You can rest easy knowing that he got the fattest tip my college student bank account could allow, though he deserved way more than that. I'm confident in saying that. Looking back, I'm sure that man may have just saved my life that night. I never imagined I'd be afraid of my own shadow, but that's exactly what happens when you realize someone is watching your every move. What started as a budget-friendly getaway quickly turned into a nightmare of surveillance and paranoia, all thanks to a host who couldn't seem to let go. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My girlfriend, Claire, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. A chance to escape the city, breathe in some fresh air, and reconnect without the constant pressure of work and everyday life. When we stumbled upon the Airbnb listing for a charming suburban house at an unbelievably low price, we booked it right away, without a second thought. The drive out was peaceful. We left the towering skyscrapers behind, watching as the landscape slowly shifted from the urban jungle to quiet, neatly manicured lawns and rows of identical houses. The neighborhood where our Airbnb was located felt like it had been lifted from a 1950s sitcom. Cookie-cutter homes with white picket fences and perfectly trimmed hedges. We pulled up to the address, a quaint 2-story house with blue shutters and a red door. As we were unloading our bags, the front door opened, and our host stepped out. Roger, a man in his early 50s with thinning hair and a smile that seemed a little too wide, greeted us warmly. "Welcome, welcome," he said with an almost manic enthusiasm. "I'm so excited to have you here. It's been too long since I've had guests." The inside of the house was spotless, almost unnaturally so. Every surface gleamed, every cushion was perfectly plumped, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. It didn't feel like a lived-in home, it felt like a showroom. Roger gave us a tour, pointing out each feature with excessive pride. "And here's the kitchen, fully stocked, of course. Feel free to use anything you like. Oh, and the backyard, you must see the backyard." As we followed him from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered a bit too long on Claire, or how he kept finding excuses to touch our things. Straightening a jacket here, adjusting a bag there. Finally, after what felt like hours, Roger headed for the door. "Well, I'll leave you two to get settled," he said. "I'm right next door if you need anything at all." When the door closed behind him, Claire and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Is it just me?" she said. "Or was that a little intense?" I nodded, feeling a wave of relief that I wasn't the only one who felt it. "Yeah, he's definitely enthusiastic about hosting." We tried to brush off the weird vibe and enjoy the evening. We cooked dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and tried to relax. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were being watched. It started with little things. A creak in the hallway when we were both in the living room. A shadow passing by the window that didn't quite match up with the trees outside. At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing on the other side of the bedroom door. "You're just being paranoid," I told myself. "Old houses make noise. It's probably nothing." But then, as we were getting ready for bed, Claire's face suddenly went pale. "Tom," she whispered, pointing at the ceiling. Is that a camera? I looked up and my blood ran cold. There, in the corner of the bedroom, was a tiny black dome, a security camera, partially hidden by a plant. What the hell? I muttered, grabbing a chair to get a closer look. As I examined it, I realized with growing horror that it was real, and it was on. We tore through the house, our earlier unease exploding into full-blown panic. We found cameras in every room, some hidden behind pictures, others disguised as smoke detectors. Our private weekend getaway had turned into a sick surveillance experiment. We need to leave, Claire said, her voice shaking. Now, I agreed. But as we started to pack our things, we heard a key in the lock. The door swung open, and there stood Roger, that too wide smile still plastered on his face. Is everything all right? He asked, his eyes darting between us and our half-packed bags. I thought I heard some commotion. We're leaving, I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. We found the cameras. This is completely unacceptable. Roger's smile didn't falter, but something changed in his eyes. A coldness crept in, replacing the manic cheerfulness from earlier. Cameras, he said, feigning innocence. Oh, those old things, they're not even connected. Just left over from the previous owners. Nothing to worry about. They're on, Claire snapped. We saw the lights. We're not stupid. Roger's smile finally dropped. He stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. Now, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Let's not do anything hasty. You've only just arrived. It would be a shame to cut your stay short. I stepped in front of Claire, my heart pounding. We're leaving, I repeated. Get out of our way. Roger didn't move. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, I've grown quite fond of you both already. I think you'll find that extending your stay will be in everyone's best interest. The implication in his words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at Claire, saw the fear in her eyes, and made a split-second decision. I lunged at Roger, catching him off guard. We tumbled to the floor, grappling for control. Claire, run, I shouted. She didn't hesitate, grabbing our bags and bolting for the door. Roger was stronger than he looked, and it took everything I had to keep him pinned down. I heard the car start outside and knew Claire had made it out. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from Roger's grasp. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I leapt into the passenger seat of our car just as Claire was pulling away from the curb. As we sped down the street, I saw Roger in the rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching us. Even from a distance, that horrifying smile was still plastered on his face. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached a motel in a town several miles away. We paid in cash, locked ourselves in, and spent the night on edge, jumping at every noise. The next morning, we reported everything to the police and Airbnb. But when the authorities arrived to investigate, the house was empty. No cameras, no Roger, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. It was as if our entire terrifying experience had been some sort of shared delusion. We tried to move past it, to forget about that weekend. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear breathing just outside the door. I check my phone compulsively for hidden apps, scan my apartment for tiny lenses, and every time I pass a house with blue shutters and a red door, I can't help but wonder, is Roger in there, waiting for his next unsuspecting guests? Are there other houses out there filled with hidden cameras and overly friendly hosts with unsettling smiles? I'll never use Airbnb again. Hotels may be pricier, but at least there, anonymity comes with the price. No overly eager hosts. No perfectly manicured lawns hiding sinister secrets. Claire and I are still together, but that weekend left its mark. We're more cautious now, more aware of the dangers that can lurk behind a friendly face or a good deal. We've learned the hard way that sometimes the cost of privacy is higher than any savings on accommodation. So, if you ever book a place to stay and the deal seems too good to be true, remember our story. Look for cameras hidden in plain sight. And if your host seems a little too interested in your plans, a little too eager to make you feel at home, trust your instincts. Because you never know who might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to turn your vacation into a prison. And once you're caught in their web, it might be too late to escape. The suburbs may look peaceful, with their identical houses and pristine lawns, but behind those picket fences and red doors, darkness can hide. And sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who greet you with a smile. They say curiosity killed the cat, but they never warned what it could do to marine biology students who uncover their mentor's darkest secrets. I went to that secluded island seeking knowledge about marine life, only to discover how quickly the hunter can become the hunted. It was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. When Dr. Carlson, one of the leading marine biologists in the field, invited me to assist with his research on a remote island off the coast of Washington, I could hardly believe my luck. His pioneering work on deep-sea ecosystems was revolutionary, and the chance to study under him was a dream come true for a grad student like me. The island itself was tiny, barely even a dot on the map. As our small chartered boat neared the shore, I saw the research station sitting on the rocky coastline, a group of prefab buildings that looked strangely out of place against the wild landscape. Dr. Carlson was there to greet us, his weathered face lighting up with a friendly smile. "Welcome to your home for the next few months," he said, helping me with my luggage. "I hope you're ready for some hard work and unforgettable discoveries." The first few weeks were everything I had imagined and more. We spent our days gathering samples, analyzing data, and engaging in fascinating discussions about marine biology. Dr. Carlson was brilliant, his passion for the work contagious. I felt like I was learning more in those few weeks than I had in entire semesters at university. But as time passed, I started noticing strange things, subtle at first. Dr. Carlson would vanish for hours without any explanation. There was a locked room at the research station that no one was allowed to enter. And at night, I'd sometimes hear unsettling sounds, almost like animal cries, but unlike anything I'd ever heard. When I asked the other researchers about these oddities, they just shrugged it off. "That's just how the doc is," they'd say. "He's eccentric, but he's a genius. You get used to it." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My curiosity, the very trait that had driven me to pursue marine biology, now gnawed at me relentlessly. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to do some exploring. The research station was quiet, everyone else long asleep. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding with each step. As I approached the locked room, I heard it again, that strange, muffled cry that sent chills down my spine. I knew it was wrong, but I had to know what was behind that door. Using the skills I'd picked up in my misspent youth, I managed to pick the lock. As the door swung open, the smell hit me first, a mix of salt water and something else, something organic and wrong. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, I had to stifle a scream. The room was filled with tanks, but these weren't ordinary aquariums. Inside were creatures I had never seen before, things that shouldn't exist. Fish with too many eyes, cephalopods with grotesquely enlarged brains, crustaceans with limbs that looked almost human. And in the largest tank at the back of the room, something so alien I couldn't even begin to classify it. But it wasn't just the creatures themselves that horrified me. It was their condition. Many looked sick or injured with visible surgical scars. Equipment that looked more at home in a medical lab than a marine research facility lined the walls. This wasn't conservation or study. This was experimentation. I was so absorbed in my shock that I didn't hear the footsteps behind me until it was too late. Fascinating, isn't it? Dr. Carlson's voice made me jump. I spun around to find him standing in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with an intensity I'd never seen before. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find your way in here. Dr. Carlson, what is all this?" I managed to stammer out. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "This, my dear, is the future of marine biology. These creatures represent evolutionary leaps that would take 1 million of years to occur naturally. But with a little nudge, we can accelerate the process." As he spoke, moving from tank to tank with an almost fatherly pride, the full horror of what I was seeing sank in. Dr. Carlson wasn't just studying these animals. He was creating them, modifying them, playing God with the building blocks of life itself. But this is wrong, I said, finding my voice. It's unethical. It's cruel. Dr. Carlson's face hardened. Cruel. What's cruel is the destruction humans have wrought on our oceans. These creatures are the key to survival in a changing world. They're adapted to withstand pollution, temperature changes, acidity levels that would kill their natural cousins. He turned to me, his eyes burning with fervor. Don't you see? This is how we save the oceans, by creating life that can withstand what we've done to them. I shook my head, backing away. This isn't saving anything. It's monstrous. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. I had hoped you would understand, that you would see the importance of this work. But if you can't, he sighed heavily. Well, I'm afraid I can't let you leave this island. The threat in his words was clear. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but I was trapped. Trapped on an island with a man I now realized was dangerously unhinged, surrounded by others who either agreed with him or were too afraid to speak up. What are you going to do? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dr. Carlson smiled, but it was a cold, clinical expression. Why? I'm going to give you the opportunity to contribute to science in the most profound way possible. Your young, healthy body will be perfect for my next series of experiments. Terror surged through me. I looked around frantically for something, anything I could use as a weapon. But before I could move, I felt a sharp prick in my neck. I turned to see one of the other researchers standing behind me, an empty syringe in his hand. I'm sorry, he mumbled, not meeting my eyes, but the work is too important. As the sedative took hold, my legs gave way. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Dr. Carlson leaning over me, his face a mask of scientific curiosity. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to be, I was strapped to a table in a different room, one that looked like a cross between an operating theater and a mad scientist lab from a horror movie. The other researchers were there, prepping equipment, avoiding my gaze. Dr. Carlson loomed over me, a scalpel glinting in his hand. Don't worry, he said, misinterpreting my terrified expression. You won't feel a thing. And just think, you'll be part of something revolutionary. As he lowered the scalpel, I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a commotion, shouting, the sound of breaking glass. Dr. Carlson's head snapped up. What the hell? He muttered. The door swung open, and to my shock, men in Coast Guard uniforms stormed in, guns drawn. Step away from the table, one of them commanded. Hands where we can see them. In the chaos that erupted, I pieced together what had happened. My parents, growing worried after not hearing from me for weeks, had contacted the authorities. When the Coast Guard attempted to check on the station and received no response, they staged a raid. The following days were a blur of interrogations, medical exams, and police statements. Dr. Carlson and his team were arrested, facing a slew of ethical violations and criminal charges. The creatures in the lab were taken by the government, their future uncertain. As for me, I became an unintended whistleblower, despite the fact that my discovery had been entirely accidental. The scientific community was rocked by the scandal, with fierce debates about the ethics of genetic modification and the lack of oversight at remote research facilities. But the entire ordeal changed me in ways I couldn't have predicted. My love for marine biology remained. However, it was now balanced by a deep understanding of the responsibility that comes with scientific knowledge. I could no longer look at the ocean the same way. I found myself wondering what secrets it might hold, both natural and man-made. In the years that followed, I threw myself into ethical marine research and conservation, determined to protect the oceans without resorting to the extreme methods I had witnessed. While the nightmares of my time on the island eventually faded, I never forgot the lessons I learned. Science, as powerful as it is, can be twisted into something sinister when detached from ethics and compassion. It's up to each of us in the scientific field to stay vigilant, to question, and to remember that our true responsibility is not to our ambitions or egos, but to the natural world we strive to understand and protect. The ocean still calls to me, but now, in its waves, I hear both a warning and an invitation. A reminder that the greatest monsters aren't always the ones with scales and fins. Sometimes, they're the ones in lab coats who have lost sight of the line between discovery and destruction. This happened a few years ago, and honestly, it's the reason I'm so much more cautious when I'm out and about nowadays. I'm talking about carrying keys between my fingers if I'm out alone after 6 p.m., packing spray deodorant in my bag if I can squeeze it in, and occasionally carrying a craft knife in there too. It all started after I had an interview in the city center and met up with a couple of girlfriends afterward. I was dressed quite nicely. A white blouse, black cardigan, black trousers, not jeans, and some cute kitten heels. It had been raining, so I was a bit damp and, well, not looking my best. Think wet t-shirt contest gone wrong at a car wash. After my friends headed home, I hopped on the bus that stopped right outside my house. It wasn't late, around 4 p.m. in the summer, so it was still light out, and the rain had stopped by then. I sat at the back of the bus, where there are usually 9 seats, 4 facing backward and 5 facing forward. The heat from the engine of the old bus helped warm me up a bit. There was a guy, Frank, already sitting there, tucked away in a corner. I had my headphones in, so I figured he wouldn't talk to me or would be harmless. I was wrong. As soon as the bus started moving, Frank shuffled over next to me and said something. I took an earphone out and asked him what he said, and he pretty much just said, "Hey, how's it going? What have you done today, Missy?" I replied politely, then started putting my headphones back in, but he kept talking. This time, he introduced himself and reached out to shake my hand. Thank you, parents, for teaching me quick thinking, because I gave him a fake name and shook his hand. He wouldn't let go for what felt like a solid minute and was staring at my cleavage before I even said my name. I pulled my hand away, but he immediately put his hand on my thigh. This was the point where I should have gotten the bus driver involved or at least moved seats. Guess what? I did neither. We kept talking for about 5 more minutes, and I think the physical contact threw me into minor shock. I froze. He started asking me personal questions after asking how the interview went, like who I lived with, whether anyone would be home when I got there, and so on. I lied and said my girlfriend would be waiting for me and cooking dinner. I was very much single, but he didn't need to know that. Like every creepy old guy on a bus, he started asking about our relationship, how long we'd been together. Would we get married? Did we want kids? Would we need a donor? Your usual nonsense, really. While he was asking all this stuff, a young guy, Sam, who was maybe my age at the time, had gotten on the bus, made eye contact with me and sort of half smiled, then went back to the top deck. So after Frank asked the somehow line-crossing question of will your girlfriend be waiting for you in the shower, I stood up and told him I had recognized a friend go upstairs and practically ran up the stairs to the top deck where I explained everything to Sam. He let me sit by him in case Frank came upstairs after me. The question was line-crossing for me, I think, because of the way he stared at me when he said it. I was vividly remembering him licking his lips and clearing his throat and everything. It was vile. I got home about 5 minutes after going upstairs. Frank was thankfully no longer on the bus. When I got into the house, nobody was home. My parents and sister were all out elsewhere, and I tried calling them all, but nobody answered. So I cried and shook and threw up, alone, for almost 2 hours. I was a shaky mess even when they got home and had nightmares for weeks and saw him everywhere I went, although when I checked, he definitely wasn't there. Never saw him again and wrote in a report to the bus company, I think, telling them the day and rough time I was on the bus, where I sat, and roughly what he looked and I looked like. I honestly got the creeps just writing about this, even though I've wrote about it briefly in an Ask Reddit comment in the past. I work at a nonprofit organization that assists individuals dealing with mental health or substance use challenges. Our services are offered both in-home and through a warm line for those seeking support. In this field, you come across transformative moments, heartbreaking traumas, recovery stories, overdoses, and everything else in between. To put it simply, very little surprises those of us working in this line of work. However, this particular experience caught me completely off guard. A few years ago, we had a man who would call almost every day from a private number. Initially, the topics of his calls seemed innocent enough, but over time, they took a disturbing turn. He started by discussing personal concerns at home, but as his calls became more frequent, he began to overshare increasingly inappropriate details. It escalated to the point where he made deeply unsettling comments to the women on our team. At one point, he revealed that he enjoyed super gluing women to chairs and watching them struggle to free themselves. The first time I heard that, I felt a wave of shock, a strange mix of cold and heat rushing through me. I was so horrified and angry that I quickly ended the call, not knowing what to say in response. For a few weeks, he stopped calling. Then, one day, when things were quiet at the office and our mid-shift worker had called in, I found myself alone at the desk. We usually tried to fill in for shifts, but since there were no clients at the time, I thought it would be fine to handle things on my own. That turned out to be a huge mistake. As I was going about my duties, doing paperwork and tidying up the space, I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and anyone wishing to visit or stay must call in advance for security and confidentiality purposes. I walked over to the frosted glass of the door and saw the outline of a man standing on the other side. I cracked the door open, greeting him firmly, asking what he needed. He stared at me with an expression that wasn't overtly threatening, but something about it didn't feel right. After a brief pause, a voice I instantly recognized said, "I need to talk." He pushed the door open and walked in as I stood there, frozen in disbelief. He continued, picking up right where he left off during our previous conversations. "So let's talk," he said with a chuckle. As calmly as I could, I motioned for him to sit at the dining room table and took the seat across from him. His gaze never left mine, and as soon as he spoke again, I knew for certain it was him. With a cold, almost amused look in his eyes, he said, "I have this problem." He paused before continuing, "Well, I don't know if it's really a problem, but I just can't stop doing it, and I don't know what to do. I like gluing women to chairs. I like knowing that I'm causing them pain, and that they're stuck because of me. I enjoy watching them struggle. It makes me feel better than anything else I've ever done. The feeling is euphoric. It was taking everything in me to not cry on the spot. This was causing every alarm signal in my body to scream at me to get out or get harmed." I slowly slid my hand towards the work phone, while looking at every possible exit and finding a flaw in every potential escape route, and hoping that he would not notice. As my pinky edged the case of the phone, I saw his dark eyes flick over to where my hand was. "Am I making you uncomfortable? I assure you I'm not going to harm you. I just want to talk. Just talk," he teasingly said as I stammered out a falsely confident, "I'm not uncomfortable. My boss will be here soon." So I was just trying to see if she had messaged the work phone. He continued staring ice-cold daggers into my eyes that caused me to sit up straighter in an attempt to mask the involuntary shiver that had taken over my body. "Is that so? Well, I wouldn't want to keep you occupied any longer." As he stood up, my heart began to pound impossibly more. I had no idea if he was going to harm me, leave, or both. He began walking towards me, and as he towered over me, my heart was practically fully in my throat. At that point, he extended a hand out and said, "Thanks for the chat." I quietly grabbed the tips of his fingers and choked out a "You're welcome." He smirked at me as he began walking to the door. As soon as he shut the door behind him, I locked the deadbolt and called my director. After the incident, I installed a panic button app on the phone and put chain locks on each entrance to allow us to open the door when needing, but to hopefully help us avoid people pushing the door fully open and finding ourselves uncomfortable and in potentially dangerous situations in the future. A week went by, and I was at the office with a fairly new mid-shift team member, and she received a call from a private number. I watched as her face dropped after answering the call. I took the phone from her and introduced myself. I heard that same nauseatingly familiar voice say, "Hello, I just want to talk. I can't stop asking women their bra sizes in public." I was done. I barked out, "Sir, this is not that kind of warm line. The Addict Anonymous meetings are every Thursday, and I can give you their number." But the reason that we are here is because we have our own lived experience and traumas that do not need to be reactivated. Thank you for calling and have a good day. Months went by without seeing or hearing that voice until I was waiting for some takeout in the waiting area of a restaurant, and once again heard that spine-chilling voice enter my ears. I looked up and met those same dark eyes that caused me and my team so much panic and distress just months prior. They were there in front of me yet again. He looked panicked and taken by surprise in contrast to his amused and cocky persona that he portrayed before. He swept up the food in a hurried rush and found his way to his vehicle and tried to speed off, but not before I managed to photograph his vehicle make and model. So if he ever decided to make an impromptu visit again or drive by, we would have the information. I love my job, and I cannot stress enough that the taboo around mental health needs to be lessened. It's very unfortunate that someone was not even properly utilizing our services, and they had made such a lasting impression of myself and my other team members. I still become incredibly anxious every time I hear the doorbell ring or a knock at the door when I am alone at work. Be kind to those that are unwell and need compassion, but always be mindful of your own well-being and listen to your gut feelings, because some people with or without diagnosis or labels can be dangerous. Be safe out there. This happened in college, maybe about 7 years ago. At the time, I was living with one of my best friends, and we were both really into the bar scene and partying. We lived in a city filled with college kids, so finding a party was never a problem. And as ashamed as I am to admit it, I was out partying probably every other night. So this story starts on a night pretty much like any other. We got all dressed up and headed out on a bar crawl. We ended up at this club, one of the more popular ones in the area, and met up with my ex-roommate. The three of us were having a great time, but periodically we kept interacting with this one guy. I can't remember his name, but he seemed normal enough. He sat next to us on the smoking porch and asked me for a cigarette. He bought my friend a drink, and he was dancing near us. We even had a little conversation, although I can't for the life of me remember what it was about. But he stuck around in the background the whole night. Around 1 a.m., the three of us decided we were drunk enough and done dancing. My roommate invited me and my best friend over to her place to smoke. None of us had cars at that point, but it was a nice night, and she lived just a couple miles away. So we started walking. The downtown streets quickly transitioned into a semi-residential, semi-warehouse district area. It wasn't the best part of town, but it wasn't bad either. Usually, the streets were pretty empty. We were about halfway to her house when we noticed someone trailing behind us, getting closer. We didn't think much of it at first until we stopped to light up some cigarettes, and he caught up. We realized it was the guy from the bar. He was a bit wobbly, clearly drunk, and greeted us like we were old friends. We didn't want to be rude, but it struck all of us as a bit odd that he was there at all. We shrugged it off, though, thinking he was just drunk and harmless. I should mention now that he was a scrawny guy, tall but thin, very thin. He had a baby face with very big eyes. He just looked generally harmless and drunk. He asked if he could bum a cigarette and walk with us until he got to where he was going, which he claimed wasn't far. He was clearly unsteady on his feet, so we figured, why not? We kept walking, chatting, and getting closer to our destination, but he didn't mention where he was headed. So, finally, I asked, "Where do you live anyway?" He gave me this funny look, like I had asked something really dumb, and said, "Oh, I don't live anywhere near here." That kind of creeped us all out, so we stopped in our tracks. I asked, "Okay, well, where are you going?" And he replied, "Oh, I'm following you." At that point, I thought maybe there had been some sort of misunderstanding in his mind. So I said something like, "Okay, well, no offense, but we don't even know your name, so you're not coming with us." He looked hurt, but also angry and a little manic. Then he got loud and said, "But I told you all my name. I told each of you my name. How do none of you remember my name?" That's when my ex-roommate stepped in. She said, "Look, man, I know you're drunk, but you really need to calm down." The guy stopped right away, suddenly calm, and gave us a serious look. Then he said, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm fine. I just knew you'd trust me more if you thought I was drunk. At that point, I was done, and I said, no, I'm out. But my roommate didn't believe him and said something like, you've been stumbling this whole time. Of course, you're drunk. He shook his head, and in a completely calm tone, no slurring whatsoever, he said, no, I'm sober. I just wanted to see if you'd let me into your house. My friend asked, why? And that's when he grinned, his eyes going even wider, and said, I just wanted to see how close I could get to killing you. At that point, I had had enough. I put on my authority voice and told him, that's enough. We're leaving, and you need to go the other way now before I call the cops. He just shrugged and said, fine. We quickly turned around and left him standing there, leaning against a stop sign, smoking a cigarette and watching us go. As soon as we rounded the corner, we broke into a dead sprint and ran for a few blocks, then stopped and completely freaked out. We were in the middle of a panic-stricken whisper huddle when my friend suddenly let out a small scream, her eyes wide with terror. We turned around, and there he was. It was dark, so we couldn't make out his face, just his silhouette against the street lamps. But it was enough to recognize him, definitely him. He was striding down the road, a few blocks away, hands in his pockets, and not a trace of a stumble. He wasn't exactly running, but he was walking at an incredibly brisk pace. And in less than a minute, he was on us. Luckily, we were only a block away from my friend's place, so we started booking it there. We were almost at the front door when I suddenly realized, oh, crap, we don't want him to know where we're going. Not with just the three of us. That seemed way too dangerous. Just as I started to panic, I noticed up the block the telltale signs of a garage party. Without a second thought, we veered off in that direction. We ran up to the lawn, out of breath, trying to explain ourselves to a group of guys out front. But when we turned to point out the guy, he was gone. The partiers sympathized with us and let us hang out for a few hours. A few of them even walked us back to my friend's house. Thankfully, we never saw that guy again. And needless to say, after that, my friends and I lost our taste for partying for quite a while. About 2 years ago, my buddy and I decided to go for a drive. It was a hot summer night, and we were completely bored. So we picked up some cigarettes and headed out for a late-night drive. We figured we'd drive up to the top of the mountain. The base of the mountain was about an hour away from where I lived, and it took another hour to reach the top, where there was a restaurant and a bar. It was pretty late, around 3 a.m. We knew the bar would be closed, but we thought we'd hang out on the benches, have a smoke, and watch the sun come up. So we made our way to the base of the mountain and began driving up. The road twisted around the mountain, and at each turn you couldn't see around the corner. It was pitch black outside, with only the road illuminated by streetlights. Beyond the road, the rest of the mountainside was barely visible. We had been driving for about half an hour, and it was nice. The roads were completely empty, and everything was silent. It was just peaceful. But then, as we turned one of the bends, I got a sudden uneasy feeling. I could see something, or rather someone, sitting on a boulder at the edge of the road. My friend noticed it too, but he kept driving. I realized he was going to turn around and go back, since the road was too narrow to reverse on. So we slowly drove back, and I noticed that my friend seemed unaffected, acting as normal as ever. I convinced myself I was just overreacting. We parked the car across from the figure, the engine still running, and my friend called out, "Hi there, are you okay?" I didn't say anything, still too scared to speak. There was no response. Then the figure slowly turned its head toward us, and we saw it was a woman, dressed in a plain white dress, with long, beautiful hair. But her face was stretched out, 3 times the length of a normal person's face. Her eyes were completely blank, and she wore a wide, unsettling smile. I swear we both froze in terror. We couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't say a single word. It was like we were paralyzed. I have no idea how my friend found the strength to floor the gas pedal, but he did. We got the hell out of there as fast as we could. When we got home, we both had high fevers, and we stayed like that for a couple of days after. It was like the experience had taken something out of us. Let me start by saying I am a female and I'm not your typical mail carrier. I was hired to deliver mail in the rural areas of a town near where I live. I don't walk door to door like most mail carriers you see. I usually just drive to each mailbox out here in the country. Every once in a while, I have to leave my truck and deliver the mail to someone's door, usually because the mailbox is surrounded by overgrown weeds, rusted shut, or in some cases, they just don't have one at all. Something creepy happened on my third day. I had parked my truck and was walking down a long driveway to deliver the mail to a house. Their mailbox was completely surrounded by weeds and spider webs. It was raining, and I could barely see through my glasses. As I walked, I suddenly tripped and landed in a puddle. I couldn't believe it. I was soaked. I scrambled to my feet and looked around for whatever I had tripped on. I didn't see anything, just felt confused and annoyed. I bent down to pick up the mail I had dropped, now soaking wet. After gathering the mail, I jogged up to the front door, rang the doorbell, and left the mail in front of it. Turning around, I started heading back down the driveway, jogging to get back to my warm truck as quickly as possible. As I got closer, I saw a man standing by the front of my truck. When he saw that I noticed him, he ducked behind it, almost like a child trying to hide from an adult. I turned around and heard a noise behind me. Now, there were two men standing on the porch, just watching me as I left. The way they stood there watching me gave me an eerie feeling. I made it to my truck, walked around it, and noticed that the man who had been by my truck was no longer there. I didn't feel safe. I got in my truck, locked the door, and drove away, freezing cold from falling in that puddle earlier. The next day, I returned to the same house. It wasn't raining this time, so I could see clearly as I walked up the driveway. But I stopped suddenly when I saw a thin wire stretched across the driveway, right before the puddle I had fallen in the day before. I couldn't believe my eyes. Then, I noticed a person crouched down behind the bushes next to the puddle. I immediately turned around and walked back to my truck. When I got inside, I locked the door again and started to drive away. As I did, I glanced up the driveway and saw the man standing up next to the puddle, and the same two men were still standing on the porch. I called my boss later and argued about permanently switching routes, as I didn't want to be anywhere near that house again. He finally agreed, and I never went back to that house. I never heard of anyone else having trouble delivering mail there either. In 2015, I got lucky enough to win a 2-day yacht tour that a local boat rental shop was raffling off. It was a short cruise with meals included, and a captain would guide us around. I never win anything, so when I entered the contest, I didn't expect to have a chance. I figured there would be thousands of entries, and only 2 would be chosen. So, I was completely shocked when I got the notification that I had won. 2 people were chosen, and each could bring a guest over the age of 21. Naturally, I brought my partner, and the other winner brought his wife. The other couple, Robert and Carol, were older but funny and outgoing. Definitely not bad company for almost 2 days. We met the captain, his first mate, and the store owner on the dock at 2 p.m., with the plan to set sail at 3:30. After a safety briefing, a tour of the boat, and being shown our very tiny rooms, we were ready. I don't know why I was expecting the kind of yacht Jeff Bezos would have, but this wasn't quite that. The yacht was nice enough, old and small, but definitely better than the non-existent yacht I own, so no complaints. I mention the age of the boat because I think it plays a role in what happened next. We set sail on time and made our way out into open sea. By 6 p.m., it felt like we were thousands of miles from shore, with the sun dipping lower in the sky. From the top of the boat, the view was breathtaking. Nothing but water stretching out as far as I could see, with a cargo ship way off in the distance. The water was a deep, dark blue, and the setting sun cast a perfect line along the horizon that looked like the edge of the earth. There was a table, some chairs for sitting, spots of shade, and complimentary champagne. Dinner would be served in about half an hour, So we enjoyed some champagne with Robert and Carol, swapping stories and marveling at how lucky we were to be there. So we thought. Dinner came and went, and everything was going perfectly. Around 9 p.m., my partner and I headed to our tiny room to get some rest. The boat was going to anchor in the morning, and we planned to swim for some exercise, so we needed sleep. By 11 p.m., we were out, but at 1 a.m., we were jolted awake by a loud banging, an alarm blaring, and a red light flashing in our room. I wish I could say this was just a bad dream, but it wasn't. We scrambled out of bed, barely dressed and terrified, half asleep. My girlfriend rushed to open the door, and as soon as she did, the first mate and the other couple were standing in the tiny hallway, wide-eyed, putting on life jackets and handing us ours. There was a smell of smoke in the air, and at first I thought maybe they were overreacting. This can't be real, I thought, and if it is, it's probably not that bad. Right? Wrong. We rushed through the hallway to the deck and saw the horrifying sight. Half of the boat was on fire, and it was sinking. The only light we had was from the fire itself, and beyond the boat, everything was pitch black, an abyss. The water around the boat was glowing orange, and small waves made gentle kissing sounds, drowned out by the roaring fire and the occasional crack and pop of parts of the boat melting in the flames. The normal calm the sound of waves usually brings was slowly becoming the worst sound I could ever hear. We were surrounded by complete darkness and would be for the next few hours. The captain was preparing the emergency raft. It was inflatable and just required a pull on a string. With a strong pull, the raft was quickly inflating to become a 4-foot by 6-foot bright yellow, a flimsy vessel that would keep us afloat until help came. They threw it off to the side of the boat near a small set of stairs that dipped into the water. A small rope held the raft close to the stairs. Meanwhile, all I could do was stand in shock with tears running down my face. All I could think about was my dogs. Still, not sure that this was as bad as it seems. We still have to be close to land. Boats put out an SOS. I'm getting on the life raft so I don't burn alive or drown. The captain and the first mate were talking quietly to each other. That caused me to panic some. What are they saying to each other that they can't say to us? They begin looking back and forth between the raft and the fire. At this point, I am able to figure out that the series of events that are unfolding are not ones that are working out in our favor. I hear the first mate curse loudly, and by this time we are all looking over to them to find out what we need to do. Why are we not moving into the raft yet? The fire is growing and smoke is filling the air. Maybe 10 seconds passed before the captain shouts, "Everyone onto the raft one at a time." I was waiting for him to say women and children first because this felt like it was straight out of the Titanic. The first mate got into the raft and reached his hand up to Carol while Robert held her hand to help her down the small set of metal stairs. Robert was next and they both sat down on the raft. Then I climbed down the stairs followed by my partner. The captain launched one or into the raft, untied the rope and hopped in. He gave us a push off the side of the boat as best he could. We didn't get very far with that, but the first mate had been trying to use the singular oar to paddle us away from the flames and smoke. The first few minutes, while trying to get a distance, nobody said anything. Robert was comforting Carol, and I was just staring off at the boat, anticipating a huge explosion like in the movies. However, that never happened. The boat just burned and burned, and after about 20 minutes, the fire was diminishing due to the water that was quickly sinking the boat. This seemed like an actual nightmare, and I didn't even know at that point that it was only going to get worse. The fire had been out for only a few minutes, and the only way any of us could see one another was by the dim light of the moon. Of course, the moon was not even close to full that night. It barely lit up anything. You could maybe see a foot in front of you. Anything past that was just black, never-ending darkness. The first mate made his way around, securing our life jackets tightly. I appreciated the concern, but I told him I would be fine without a life jacket. The captain had been digging around in a box that was built into the side of the raft. He pulled out what looked like an extra piece of the raft's material and a bright orange flare gun. He maneuvered slowly to the empty side of the boat, lifted up the side, and that's when we heard the gurgling of air leaving the raft and hitting the water. There is no way there's a hole in this raft. He tried a few times to pull the side up out of the water, and each time the weight of his body and inability to get any leverage to use force to keep the underside up and out of the water long enough to try to patch the rip. The first mate tried to assist, but it all seemed like a waste of effort. Finally, in desperation, they peeled a clear seal off the side of the extra wrapped material, pulled up the side as hard as they could, and reached all the way over to slap the patch on. Unfortunately, this was not a success. They were unable to patch the rip in the side of the life raft. The only thing keeping us out of the pitch-black ocean was slowly sinking. After a few minutes of exchanging cuss words, tight tugs, and a few words of encouragement, it was time to get real about the situation that was happening. We were about to become stranded in the ocean, just floating there with miles of nothingness around us, above us, and below us. After all, we were close to the southern end of the Mariana Trench, which is known to be the deepest part of the ocean. This gives me chills to think about, miles away from the next sign of human life. The raft was losing its air, and the inflated sides were becoming soft to the touch, squishing easily under the pressure of my hand. The flare gun went off. It was a silent star shooting way up into the sky and then a pop like a firework. The light was so bright from the flare. I could see regret and fear in the older couple's eyes. I knew at this point that we had about 30 minutes until the raft was just a piece of flat yellow rubber and nylon. Nothing much was said in those last few minutes other than we learned we were almost 100 miles off the coast of where we departed, and nobody, another boat, or the Coast Guard had responded to our SOS. Luckily, we knew that the area of the ocean we were in was considered a high-traffic area for cargo and importing ships, so it was unlikely that we would never be found. It was probably just going to take a while to be found. Still, in the dead of night, floating helplessly amongst the creatures of the sea for even just 1 minute, is 1 minute too long? It wasn't much longer before we were all submerged and watching water take over the flat raft as it sank a foot. 2 feet, 3 feet, and by 4 feet it was a pale dark yellow mass losing its brightness to the sea. It was barely visible, but I had to watch it to see just how far it would go until it disappeared. That was a mistake, because when I tell you that freaked me out more than anything. I mean it. We all stayed close to each other, just floating in the small waves. I don't know if I purposely tried to scare myself, but all I could imagine was the sea creature swimming below us. No matter how deep, I knew at every moment there was likely something there. I am an avid fan of Shark Week, so I knew that sharks become more active at night, dusk and dawn. We were just at the whim of the ocean waves. I didn't care that I was tired or hungry. I could only envision myself at any second being dragged deep into the ocean by a shark to drown to death. Still barely alive when it let go of me, but too far down to float up fast enough to get a gasp of life-saving oxygen. Or even worse than this happening to me, happening to the love of my life, who remained brave and stoic during this whole ordeal. If I had to watch something bad happen to her, I would rather it just be me. For hours and 2 flares had gone by when I could see the sky start to lighten up. The sun was rising. For some reason, the thought of daylight was comforting. I was still going to be floating around, but I could see now. Dawn was here, and I could see if there were any threats around us, or if boats were passing by that were able to see the wreckage of our flare signals. Help could see us. It wouldn't be long now until I am on dry land. Again, wrong. The sun was getting higher into the sky. Despite everything, it was beautiful. The pinks and oranges from the ocean that was no longer black but blue. I decided to do a 360 and turn around to see everything around us. That's when it happened. My biggest fear of free floating. Something bumped my submerged legs. Something big. I screamed a blood-curdling scream, and the only words I could get out of my mouth were big, my leg, shark. At that moment, I had no idea if it was really a shark. I just assumed the worst because obviously, after this whole adventure, the worst happens to me. And what else would I expect? Shark Week comes in handy again. I remember to try not to panic and that they are attracted to shiny jewelry. I decided to take out my earrings and I tossed them into the open water away from us. The idea was that the shark would go after my earrings. It sounds dumb when I say it out loud now, but I would have tried anything. I just sat there and tried not to kick my legs, but also tried not to lay on my back and float, trying not to resemble a fat seal. We were all just darting our eyes and bodies around to look for any signs it was still around. All of a sudden, Robert let out a yelp. He too had been bumped. A quick splash at the top of the surface about 5 feet away revealed a large fin. We were still unable to tell if it was a shark by the fin or a dolphin, but I don't know much about dolphins. I didn't know if they lurked around the way this thing was. I guess the earrings didn't work. I don't know why I thought that was such a genius plan. We all came in closer to each other, hoping to give the image that we looked bigger to the fish. I would be lying to say that each time someone accidentally kicked me while trying to keep afloat that I didn't freak out, but I did, and each time scared me more. Some time had passed, and there was no sight of fins breaking the surface or any large dark masses swimming below us. I don't think we would be able to really tell since we were basically eye level with the water, but everything seemed calm for the time being. We were all hungry, complaining of hunger and thirst a while later. I figured at this point it must have been 10 a.m. Already in the blazing sun, my girlfriend was sunburnt. Her face was beet red and her lips dry and cracked from exposure, dehydration, and salt water. I eventually pulled off my shirt and used it to provide some shade for her. I was shirtless underneath my life jacket. Whoever rescued us was in for a treat. The thought of not being rescued before we perished to the bottom of the ocean crossed my mind, and I was starting to spiral. Everyone was trying to remain positive, but not me. I guess I was the only one who witnessed every single mishap that led us up to that moment. Screw toxic positivity. Screw good vibes only. We are in a serious situation, and despite being surrounded by never-ending water, none of us had a single drop since at least 9 hours ago. Is nobody else concerned about dehydration? I knew I was getting snippy with people who didn't deserve it and have their own way of dealing with things, but I was having trouble seeing the bright side. All of a sudden, a loud horn filled the air. It was like music to my ears. Help was close. Behind Carol, a red cargo ship appeared on the horizon, maybe half a mile away. The captain fired the last flare, and the ship's horn blared twice. They saw us. They were coming. The tension in the air shifted, and suddenly, all the fears of giant sea monsters and sunburns faded away. There was a collective sigh of relief. Almost immediately, I started planning what I would do when we reached land. I was going to hit up a drive-thru, slam down a gallon of Pedialyte, take a Xanax, hold my partner and our dogs tight, and swear to never set foot on a boat again. The cargo ship threw over some floating devices, and we clung to them as a Coast Guard helicopter approached from the other side of the boat. The wind from the chopper sprayed salt water into our eyes, and the droplets stung my face like tiny bee stings. They lowered a man into the water, who then attached each of us to what I think was a stretcher, one by one, reeling us up to the helicopter. When we were all safely inside and ready to head back to land, the chopper hovered over the wreckage. It was some distance from where we had been picked up. I looked down and thought about the incredible odds of everything happening. The moment I dropped that raffle ticket into the bucket a few months ago, and regret filled me. As I looked down at the wreckage, I noticed something dark in the water. Then another, smaller shape, followed by 2 more. The wreckage was swarming with sharks. The Coast Guard guy beside me saw it too and commented, "This area is notorious for shark activity. You all are lucky to have made it out alive and with all your limbs intact. There were a lot of sharks near where we picked you up." The chopper roared, making my ears ache as we took a sharp left turn. I lay my head back and glanced over at my partner, who was applying Neosporin to her lips, while the other couple removed their life jackets and used a stethoscope to check their heart or lungs. I wasn't sure. I didn't respond to the Coast Guard guy about the sharks. I couldn't bring myself to comment on it. Instead, I unbuckled my life vest and asked if they had a shirt I could borrow.